Apologies and substitutions. We have an apology from Councillor Ray Evans from Telford today, and there are no substitutes from Telford. But I would like to take this opportunity to give a very warm welcome to a new member of the committee, Councillor Carolyn Healy from Telford and Reading. And I think it's also opportune at this moment if we should just go round the room and particularly the members to begin with to introduce themselves, and then we will ask the officers to introduce themselves also. I'm not going to ask our colleagues who are remote, because I think they can introduce themselves when they speak to their particular items. So without further ado, I'm Tom Diggins. I'm a Shropshire councillor and I'm chair of the Pensions Committee. Let's go to Simon.
Hello, I'm Simon Harris. I'm also a Shropshire councillor and I sit on the Pensions Committee.
Roger Evans, Shropshire councillor for a division called Longdon and a member of this committee.
Ryan Williams, I'm a Shropshire councillor and I've been a member of this committee now for 6 or 7 years.
And then we also have representatives. Jean?
Yeah, I'm Jean Smith.
Byron? You need to stand by. This is right.
I'm Byron. Hello, I'm Laura Hoskinson. I'm also an employee representative representing Shrewsbury, Shropshire.
Okay. And also Carolyn, do you just want to introduce yourself?
I'm Caroline Healy and I'm top leading council for the Adams Board.
Okay, thank you very much. But those are the members of the Pensions Committee. Now we will just introduce officers, starting with Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin Bridges. I'm the head of Treasury and Pensions.
Hello, I'm James Walton, and I'm the Council Executive Director of Resources and Pension Scheme Administrator for the Shropshire County Pension Fund.
And we also have a number of advisors with us today and presenters. So starting with Emily.
Hello, I'm Emily Mcguire from Aon, Investment Advisor to the fund.
Valborg.
Yeah, good morning. So I work for LGPS Central in the RI and engagement team, and I head up engagement and voting activities.
Yes, I'm Patrick O'Hara. I head up the RI&E function, responsible investment engagement function at LGPS Central.
And most importantly, one of our most important officers, Debbie.
Yeah, Debbie Sharp, Pensions Administration Manager. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for that. We'll now move to item 2, the appointment of vice chairman. Can I take nominations, please?
Yes, if I may nominate Councillor Ray Evans.
Thank you. And I'd like to second.
I'll second.
Oh, okay, Brian will second Graham. Thank you very much. Any other nominations? No. Well, in that case, Ray Evans, Councillor Ray Evans, has been elected as our vice chairman. Thank you all very much for that. Item 3, disclosable pecuniary interests. Do we have any disclosable pecuniary interests? No. We'll move on then to item 4, the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 25th of June. Are you happy that I take this as a true correct record? I move. Thank you. Second of these. Thank you very much. Great. I'll sign. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 5, and we are now on public questions. And I understand Sarah Townsend will be bringing in our first person to ask a question. I think you've received copies of the questions committee and answers. We are taking the first 3 questions together with 1 response, which James will read out. So I guess the questioners who are here in person there in the room next door will be coming through to actually answer their question. Laura, yes.
Purely just to say, yes, we have got a copy of the questions, we haven't got a copy of the answer.
Great. But we still have to go through all that. Yeah. I've just, hello, good morning. I've just explained to the committee, we're taking all 3 questions together, so we'll ask you to read out each question individually, and then there will be 1 answer at the end of the first 3 questions. And I know we have with us Claire Cooper, and we also have Chris Welsh. And Chris, I was just wondering, in the absence of Dr. Jamie Russell, would you be prepared to read out question as well? Okay, so we'll move to the first question from Claire Cooper, please.
Good morning. I'm Claire Cooper from Broseley in Shropshire. I'm a retired physiotherapist and very interested in particularly public health.
It's just a question. So,
yeah,
sorry.
I'm just introducing myself.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question here. In case you have not read the latest Ipcc report, here are some quotes. The Ipcc 6th Assessment Report, the AR6, is the most important assessment of humanity's future on Earth to date. Can everyone hear me okay? Never have we had so much scientific evidence to demonstrate that we are in the midst of a global climate emergency. As the Ipcc makes clear, the coming 9 years until 2030 are critically decisive and will set in motion changes that will impact humanity for the coming centuries, if not millennia. They say that everyone must phase out fossil fuels at record speed, cutting emissions in half each decade. We can see the Ipcc report as the final warning, the bells signalling the final round. It is now or never. There is no room left for manoeuvre, no carbon budget left to spend. And this is quotes from the Climate Crisis Advisory Group from their report called The Final Warning Bell, August 2021. In addition, information from the next year's draft Ipcc report states that global greenhouse gas emissions must peak in the next year. Coal and gas-fired power plants must close in the next decade, and lifestyle and behavioural changes will be needed to avoid climate breakdown. It is clear that fossil fuels must be phased out. It's either that fossil fuels become history or humanity will become history. It's that clear. Any short-term increase in share price would present the opportunity for divestment with minimum financial loss to the fund. My question from all of this is, from these stark and urgent warnings, how does the Shropshire County Pension Fund Committee justify continuing to invest in fossil fuels, which will become worthless assets even within the short term? For moral and ethical reasons for continuing to invest in the ultimate destruction of the earth and all its inhabitants, including yourselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And the second question, please, from Chris Welsh.
Yeah, I prefer to stand if you don't mind. Just to very briefly introduce myself, my name's Chris Welsh. I'm here because I read the IPCC reports and the climate crisis reports, and I understand the Keeling curve and the thermal lag delay between rising CO2 levels and rising temperature levels. Because of that, I'm here to do everything in my power in my own personal life and around to stop burning fossil fuels.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
a very long
Appreciate that.
introduction.
Thank you.
Straight to the question, please.
Okay. In response to previous questions, SCPF has given these reasons against divesting. One is that engagement is effective in changing company behaviour. Engagement is effective for many issues that have negligible impact on the core product of fossil fuel company. The largest gas and oil producers, including Shell and BP, are still not aligned with the Paris Agreement. And here are just two of many examples of fossil fuel greenwashing. Shell only commits to reducing emissions intensity of their energy products so they can increase fossil fuel production if balanced with renewable capacity. And BP's policies exclude its stake in Rosneft, which accounts for 1/3 of its global production. Tragically, new drilling has been announced this year. Shell off the coasts of Texas and Brazil, and BP off the edge of the world's largest cold water coral reef. This year, the International Energy Agency said there can be no further fossil fuel expansion in any country beyond 2021 if global climate goals are to be met. Intensive engagement with major fossil fuel companies has been going on for decades with negligible real impact. Their anti-climate lobby built on the tactics used by the tobacco industry. With the domino effect of climate feedback loops that are beginning to happen and the speed of climate breakdown, the policy of engagement is equivalent to doing nothing. Another reason you say is that the fund needs a diverse portfolio. An investigation by Imperial London found that diversification is not lost by investment. That investors with long-term horizons should avoid oil and chemical stocks on investment grounds, and that fossil fuel companies are fighting decarbonisation tooth and nail. Divestment need not affect the number of asset managers and the number of fossil fuel companies you have, which is roughly only 6. They account for a tiny percentage of the fund's total. Divestment will not compromise diversity. You've also said divested stock may be bought by others with lower ESG principles. By this argument, the fund should include shares in, for example, drugs, guns, sex shops, etc., in order to keep others from having them. The fiduciary duty side is to look after the pension fund, not retain high-risk investments just in case someone else buys them. And you said diversity will adversely impact other companies that rely on fossil fuels. The same argument as above applies. The fiduciary duty is to look after the pension fund. And additionally, other industries are making their own transitions to renewables. So SCPF, for example, major shareholders, AstraZeneca, Tesco, Microsoft, are acting on their decarbonisation plans and moving to renewable energy. Technology is rapidly advancing. So, for example, a Swedish company is producing steel without the use of fossil fuels. And in Canada, a company makes carbicrete, a cement-free concrete. Industries can see the future and are racing to ditch fossil fuels. So my question is, what other reasons does the fund have against divestment?
Thank you very much. Please, will you read question 3 on behalf of Dr. J.B. Russell?
I will. And Dr. Russell says he regrets not being here today in person to read out his question. He is a father and a children's author, and says he's terrified by the Ipcc's recent report, which states we're at code red for the continued survival of humanity. And his question is, to date, over 11 trillion has been committed to divest from fossil fuels by institutional investors and groups around the world. Divestment is not an untried option. Many institutions have done it, and none have regretted or reversed the decision. Among those who committed to divestment are UK councils, universities, churches, government pension funds, insurance companies, and many others. The largest UK pension fund by members, Nest, announced their divestment in March 21. And Nest stated that by reinvesting directly in green energy generation, it will secure stable, long-term returns for pension savers, whilst also achieving its ambition of becoming a net zero carbon investor. In 2014, Rockefellers, the family built on oil, divested and reinvested in clean renewable energy, saying divestment, quote, is a moral imperative to preserve a healthy planet. On the 1st of September 2021, the Finance Minister of Iraq, one of the founding members of OPEC, made an unprecedented call to fellow oil producers to move away from fossil fuel dependency and into renewable energy. In a world where government regulation against heavy polluters is getting stricter and traditional oil and gas companies are seeing their business models under threat, it simply makes good financial sense to divest. Reinvesting in renewables has several advantages. It is ethical and offers the opportunity to invest in line with your values. The sector is at the forefront of technological development. More efficient solar cells using a structure called perovskite is just one example of cutting-edge research that's leading to lucrative breakthroughs in increasing. The renewable sector benefits from world government support, including pledges from many countries to reduce their carbon footprints, requiring greater use of renewable energy. And renewable energy can boost the economy by creating jobs in rural areas and lowering fuel imports. Divestment offers the opportunity to put more pension money into financially growing and ethically better alternatives. And a recent Forbes article notes, quote, renewable energy investments are delivering massively better returns than fossil fuels in the US, the UK, and Europe, end quote. So my question is, what advantages to divestment does SCPF recognise? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd now like to ask James to respond to all three questions combined.
Thank you, Chair. We are in a situation which is extremely urgent yet complex. If you narrow the tools at your disposal to a choice of engage or divest, you easily miss the opportunities of a wide spectrum of engagement actions and escalation tactics, including company dialogue, vote against board members, public statements, shareholder proposals, industry standards, dialogue, and policy dialogue. We fear that divestment is overestimated as a tool which will create change, whereas in reality, it is a reaction more than an action. How companies manage climate-related transition and physical risks and opportunities is highly likely to affect long-term profits and company returns. The question we ask ourselves is, how can investors best encourage a broad transition towards a low-carbon economy and at the same time maintain attractive investment returns for their beneficiaries? It is not sufficient to talk only to oil and gas companies. We actively engage both fossil fuel producers and all the companies on the demand side, asking companies to set an explicit target of net zero emissions by 2050 and to provide verifiable evidence that this will be achieved in the medium and long term. To us, this is the most viable and most impactful way of using our voice. If we divested, we would lose our seat at the table, where we can directly influence as owners. An example, ExxonMobil, a company that in every regard has been much slower to react to investors' demands for transition than Shell and BP, and as a consequence, several responsible investors have divested. Other responsible investors are still invested in Exxon and succeeded this AGM in getting 3 out of 3 new board members onto the board and 3 of Exxon's existing board members out. This is, and there's a sound coming over somewhere. We okay? I'll continue. It's quite extraordinary, and the company fought to stop it happening. This was a targeted effort by minority shareholders, supported by LGPS Central, to get real change by revamping the board, which ultimately holds Exxon to account. The campaign sought 4 new board members and achieved 3. An impactful and large investor in the US, CalPERS, was recently quoted as follows, which speaks to the downside of using divestment as a tool. I quote, if a whole string of funds hadn't divested from Exxon in the last year or 2, we could have won that vote and had 4 on the board. To us, it is not about easing one's conscience nor finding the most arguments against divestment. It is about using the investor voice and the breadth of ownership tools that we genuinely believe are key to achieving real-world decarbonisation. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll now move on to question 4, please. And our fourth question is from Joanna Blackman. Welcome.
Thank you. So just briefly to introduce myself, I'm an adult education tutor with a maths and science background and mum to a 22-year-old who, like myself, is terrified by the accelerating pace of climate breakdown.
Please move on to the question. Thank you.
My question is, so in the light of the recent Ipcc report, no informed person or organisation can fail to be aware of the terrifying future that burning fossil fuels is bringing ever closer. With that knowledge comes responsibility. In the Paris Agreement, the world agreed that 1.5C heating would be catastrophic and that all efforts should be made to avoid it, and that a rise of 2C must not happen at any cost. Recent UN, Ipcc and Chatham House reports have warned that we are now on course for at least a 3 to 4 degrees rise, with consequences so deadly, catastrophic and permanent that we can barely comprehend them. Professor Kevin Anderson, Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, has said that there is a widespread view that a 4C future is incompatible with any reasonable characterisation of an organised, equitable and civilised global community. In stark contrast, climate scenarios produced by Mercer for Shropshire's TCFD report last autumn predict that 4C of heating will only impact the fund by as little as minus 0.06% to minus 0.1%, essentially no problem. And that's on table 2 of page 11 of the TCFD report. In seeking to understand this huge discrepancy, please could you clarify, does the Pensions Committee believe that table 2 on page 11 of the TCFD report reliably predicts the future of financial markets as the world burns? Secondly, what does Mercer know about the future that thousands of scientists don't know, which makes Mercer so optimistic about a world of 2C, 3C and 4C of heating? And finally, why does the committee choose to trust the predictions and opinion of Mercer, one consultancy firm, over and above the research and evidence of thousands of scientists from across a wide spectrum of disciplines, institutions and countries who are desperately urging the world to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees?
Thank you. And may we have the response, please, from James?
Thank you, Chair. Members of the Pension Committee appreciate the risks of climate change, both environmental and financial. We agree that the science is clear. Climate action failure is the standout long-term risk the world faces in likelihood and impact, according to the 2020 Global Risks Report from the World Economic Forum. If business as usual continues, the world could heat up by about 5 degrees by 2100, which would cause profound societal damages and significant human harm. Climate change is a core stewardship theme that we have asked LGPS Central to engage companies on our behalf. Through LGPS Central, we engage alongside peer investors to pursue the goals of Climate Action 100+, which stipulate 10 key asks under a net zero benchmark framework. Under the 2 degrees Celsius scenario, climate risk transition risks are prominent, while climate-related physical risks are depressed as the world mitigates the impact of climate change. In a 4°C scenario, where little corrective action is taken to tackle climate change, climate-related physical risks are higher and climate-related transition risks are lower. Therefore, an important consideration to note is that climate-related transition and physical risks impact asset classes differently across the climate change scenarios. Shropshire County Pension Fund's asset allocation has a low allocation to real assets, which are most vulnerable to physical risks, and a large allocation in fixed income assets, which are relatively less sensitive to the different climate scenarios. The analysis undertaken on behalf of Shropshire County Pension Fund is a scenario analysis rather than a deterministic prediction of future investment returns, and gives an indication of the direction of travel and the impact on different asset classes relative to each other. Shropshire County Pension Fund will periodically utilise climate scenario analysis along with a variety of other methods to assess the level of climate risk the fund is exposed to. There are difficulties in modelling the impacts and implications of climate change on a multi-asset investment portfolio, and Shropshire County Pension Fund will stay up to date on the best methodologies and tools available in the market for future climate scenario analysis. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And then question 5 is from Suzanne Freegard, please.
Hello, I'm Suzanne. I have 2 little nieces who love life, and we need to
stop you there, please. I've
Yes.
stopped everybody else. Can
Sorry.
you just go straight into the question? We know you're Suzanne Freegard, so please.
This pensions committee is set to vote on whether to divest Shropshire County Pension Fund from fossil fuel companies at its meeting in November. I would like to be assured that committee members will have the opportunity to debate and decide this important issue from the position of understanding all sides of the issue. A member question at this committee's meeting in March noted that the committee has received presentations about continued engagement with fossil fuel companies on climate change, but it has not seen much from the divestment side of the debate. Supporting this question, Councillor Melling said, "We have had a very clear steer around engagement, and that appears to be the preferred option. But there is an equally strong case, and some of us might argue an even stronger case, for divestment." Responding to the question, Chair Councillor Biggins said, "That is a point well made. We will take that on board." My question today is, has this been taken on board? Specifically, what training opportunities have been provided for committee members to learn about divestment and the experiences of other pension funds and councils which have committed to divesting? Have the arguments for divestment and sustainable reinvestment been given equal space for consideration alongside those for engagement? Also, the NGO Platform London is offering a webinar about divestment exclusively for this committee, pensions board members, and any Shropshire and Telford Wrekin councillors and officers who are interested at 6 p.m. on 13th of October. Are all committee members aware of this opportunity? Thank you.
Thank you. And the response, please, from James.
Thank you, Chair. Committee members have been on an extensive training programme over the last 12 months on all climate-related issues, and further training is planned at today's meeting and the next meeting in November. Pension committee members and pension board members have been contacted directly about the webinar. Some members have already attended the previous webinar organised by Platform London. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we've now got question 6, which I understand, Justin, you will read out question 6 from Fossil Free Shropshire.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The question is, will the committee allow fossil-free Shropshire a 5-minute opportunity to address the meeting in November?
And the response, please, from James.
Thank you, Chair. Due to COVID-19 and social distancing restrictions, which are still in place, only one member of Fossil Free Shropshire will be able to make a maximum of a 3-minute presentation in November. The presentation should be sent to officers and members at least 8 days prior to the Pension Committee meeting on the 26th of November. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll now move on to the next items on the agenda, and I propose to take items 6, 7 and 8 all together as one item because they are all interrelated. So who will be the first speaker? Will it be?
Sorry, Chair, do we have an opportunity to ask questions on these reports before we accept them?
Well, no, we haven't. We're not accepting them. We're having them presented to us, and then we can ask questions.
Right, sorry.
And then we will. Yes. So there's no problem there at all. So our first presenter will be Graham Patterson, or will it be Kerry? Sorry, Kerry. Yes. Over to you for item 6.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Kerry Plasky. I'm the Fund's Head of Internal Audit, and I hope everybody can hear me okay. I have got some groundwork going on outside, but hopefully that won't disturb. Very briefly, the audit report's in front of you, and I'm assuming everybody's read it. It confirms that we've got good assurances across all audit areas that we looked at, and we completed a full review of all the planned audit work. In addition to that, we did a piece of work on governance for the local government pension scheme, and that has no impact on the control environment of the Shropshire County Pension Fund. And so with all that data in mind, based on the work, I can say that you've got a good internal processes, governance and risk management. They're working effectively. There are details of the reports in the paragraphs for those of you that like the breakdown. In paragraph 6.9, it shows you the assurances against the different audit areas. And the other thing it shows you in 6.13 is you had no fundamental recommendations and no significant recommendations. Recommendations were only low risk, which requires attention. So that's a really good bill of health. The other thing that you need to be assured of is how good are your internal auditors, and a self-assessment goes to the Shropshire Council Audit Committee, and the full details could be found on their committee papers from July. That's all I was going to say, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions, please, members? Laura.
Hello. Hi, was it Kerry?
Yes.
Hi, nice to meet you. I've got a question for you, which I think I know the answer to, but it would be good to have it spelled out. In section 5, which is the climate change appraisal, I understand that this audit doesn't look at individual investments, which is why you put no effect in the report. But could you explain why climate exposure risk and any other risks are not looked at as part of the audit risk on the overall risk of the fund? Does the question make sense?
Yes, it does. But what we haven't done is any specific climate change audits, and this is about the internal audit process and the climate change appraisal. So it didn't impact on that. Because if you're looking at the pure internal audit process, we've worked remotely, so it's probably had less impact on carbon emissions and that, the way we've operated. So from our operations, we've not highlighted any issues. In terms of the audit work, what we do, we look at the impact of all risks, whether it's climate change, fraud and corruption, efficiencies, waste, and if it's relevant to that audit, we'll have a look at it in the scoping of that audit.
Thank you.
Okay, Laura. We have got decisions. Should we take all the decisions in a lump at the end? I think we do all 3 papers together. So any more questions for? No? Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. It was a very good report. Thank you very much indeed. We'll now move on to Grant Patterson from Grant Thornton. regarding audit findings for the pension fund, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Grant Patterson. I'm Director at Grant Thornton, and I'm the engagement lead for the audit of the pension fund. For completeness, I'm also the engagement lead for the audit of Shropshire Council's accounts and also the Borough of Telford and Wrekin's accounts as well. And in relation to pension funds, I'm also the lead on the audit of the West Midlands Pension Fund auditors, so I do have dealings with LGPS Central as well, just for completeness for the meeting. I'm joined today by my colleague Terry Tobin, who is the audit manager, who has been leading on the main audit, but I'm going to take you through the report, and Terry will provide help to any questions that might arise or more detailed comments. So this report, I think, would normally come first to you before going to audit committee. Just a reminder for members in terms of, I suppose, the council's overall governance arrangements is that the pension fund accounts form part of the council's accounts, and in relation to that, the audit committee of Shropshire Council has delegated authority in terms of approving the financial statements. The pensions committee clearly has the role of approving the annual report. So in terms of governance, what we would normally do is bring this report to you first of all to have a comment, and then presumably you then report back onto audit committee. Just at the time of the meetings this year, there was an audit committee meeting yesterday, so we have taken this report through audit committee, and Councillor Williams was on that committee yesterday. There will be a further audit committee of the council on the 22nd of October, where we will be looking to sign off the council's accounts. So if there is any comments coming back from this meeting, then there is opportunity to feed them through. So in terms, I suppose, in terms of overall work, I think what to highlight first of all is that in terms of the pension fund annual report, that was received earlier by us in early July, and we did begin undertaking some preliminary work on that. The key finding from when we're looking at that one, looking at the annual report, was, I mean, I'm sure as members are aware, the valuation statements come through from investment managers at differing times. The accounts have to be closed down on an estimated basis, and within the annual report there was one estimate that the fund had made in respect of one investment in relation to Harbour Vest for the year end, that when the year end statement came in, there was a £45 million difference in the annual report to the figure in the annual report, and our materiality for the overall fund is set at 1% of net assets, so that's around about £20 million, so it was a material difference, and therefore that was adjusted within the or will be adjusted within the annual report. From the council's perspective, and I know this is the pensions committee, but just to say, they were still closing down their accounts then, so they were able to put that adjustment through the council's accounts before they were published at the end of July. So that adjustment won't be reflected necessarily in the council's accounts when we report to them in our audit findings report. So that was the main material change as part of our audit. We have substantially completed our work on the overall elements of the fund. No significant issues to report to you in terms of that. We are actually looking to finalise our work in the next week or so, and then sign off. We are looking in terms of requirements from you. There are two elements of our audit work where we, again, due to timing differences, have identified valuation differences in respect of primary level 2 investments. And there's a 6.8 million, and I'm looking now at page 15 of our report, valuation difference between the accounts and the final fund manager statements. I say that is not material for us. And also, when we were looking at benefits, we found an error in benefits, and we've done an extrapolated uncertainty of 1.6 million in terms of benefits. So those are what we consider to be unadjusted misstatements. We've discussed them with management, and they are not material to a true and fair view of the accounts, and therefore management are not proposing to adjust for those. But we will need your approval from pensions committee that you accept that those adjustments won't be made, because they're not material individual or aggregate. So that'll be going through audit committee as well. So that's the key decision we're asking from the pensions committee today. In terms of the overall work we've also done, we would look at what the other information is, and from the pension fund's perspective, in terms of the council's account, the other information would be the narrative report within the council's accounts, etc., and the annual governance statement. We have no comments to make upon those. I would point out, I think if I take you through the report, I don't propose to go through the detailed pages, just to say in terms of that we have completed our work on significant risk in relation to improper revenue recognition, and on, if you look at page 19 of your pack, and that's where we've also highlighted the level 3 45 million change, and on page 20 is where we picked up the 6.8 million change to the accounts in that respect. In terms of other information, we've had no questions from electors or elements like that. There were no other matters to report back to you. Interestingly, picking up, I suppose, on the question that might have come through, if you look at page 24 in respect of going concern, we now look at that in a slightly different way in relation to service continuity. We've no issues with going concern, and I'm picking up, interesting, I think, on one of the members' comments around climate change. I think we do look at the value of the assets over the value of the benefits as well, that you have to pay out, and we don't have any issues around, given the level of investments you have compared to the current payment of benefits going out. There are no sort of short-term issues around the going concern of the fund. And in terms of independence, we can confirm we remain independent of the council. On page 27, we do highlight the other piece of work we do, which is provide assurances on what we call IS 19, which is pension liability figures that are used by employers, and that's primarily Shropshire Council, Telford and Wrekin Council, and Shropshire and Wrekin Fire Authority. Those letters will be going out very shortly to those auditors. I don't, is anything else I need to bring to your attention in terms of the audit adjustments? They are shown on page 30, and probably just there, just to highlight the other one in terms of disclosure changes, is we did have discussions with management and officers around the fair value disclosures of distinction between level 1s and level 2s, and there were some assets in there that we felt were more level 2. Level 1 is where is simply normally where they're traded on a daily basis, and you can get a clear market value, a clear market valuation. And level 2 is where there are not always some unobservable assumptions are in there. And having conversations with management, we've agreed, or they have agreed, that they are, some of those investments feel like level 2. It hasn't made any significant difference to the, I suppose, the level of disclosure. That really only happens if you have investments that go from level 2 to level 3, but there have been some classification changes. So that was really about the only significant thing that I think I need to bring to your attention. And on page 31, that's where the unadjusted misstatements are in relation to the account. So overall, it was a very good audit, very supportive from the pensions team, and we'll bring this report to you for comment and take questions. I don't know if Terry's got anything specific to add to what I've just gone through.
Not really. I thought that was very comprehensive. The only points I was pleased you mentioned at the end was really just to note that the audit did go very well this year. You know, despite the the difficult working environment that everyone continues to be in, there was very good cooperation, good response time. So we'd like to send our thanks to officers for all their support in getting us to this stage.
Oh, well, thank you very much, both of you, for your comments. We're delighted to hear clean bill of health, and it's an excellent report. Are there any questions, please, members?
I'd like, Brian Williams.
Yep.
I'd just like to say how comforted I am by the opinion of our own internal auditor, who in para 6A of her report says that everything is in very satisfactory working order. I won't paraphrase our whole paragraph, but there are no ifs or buts about the audit and the quality of the work of the pen. Sorry, I was saying I take comfort from the report of our own auditor,
who in para 6.8 indicates that all the activities of the pension fund are in what we might describe as good working order, and also from Grant Thornton's audit opinion, which says that they will be making an unqualified audit report, unqualified being the best report you could get on the pension fund. So in those circumstances, Chairman, I will be very happy to move the recommendations, acceptance of the recommendations in report 6, 7 and 8.
Okay. We'll come. We haven't yet done 8, but we'll keep that. We'll keep that in mind. Roger.
Thank you, Chairman. I do have a question, but I'll wait till after question 8, after we hear about 8, because it does cover items 6 and 8.
Okay, very good. Any other questions? No. Well, in that case, let's move on to agenda item 8, and I believe James, you'll be presenting.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll give a brief introduction. So paper 8 there's a covering report, and then there is the actual annual report attached to it as an appendices. The reason that we take the 3 papers together is because they are obviously all interlinked, and we're trying to be as efficient and effective as we can in terms of making sure that that rounded view is given to the committee, so that we can take questions on all 3 of those items together. So what you've heard from those 3 questions, as Councillor Williams has just reiterated, is that the internal audit report is saying that there are, there's a sound internal controls are in place, and having good assurance across all 6 of those audits is no mean feat. So I would like to congratulate the team on that personally. The external audit review also is demonstrating that there is a good levels of assurance there, and the issues that have been picked up were mentioned by Grant Patterson. So that means then, in terms of reading the actual annual report, it's done from a position of strength in that sense. So just to pick up some of the highlights within the annual report, it's just to say that the fund value has increased again this year. So the value increased by £363 million over that 12-month period. So now stands at just short of £2.2 billion, which is the highest the fund has been. During the year, we only actually received £16.5 million in contributions from employees and £70 million of contributions from employers. And over that period, scheme membership is now over 50,000 members. There will be transfers in and out of the fund over the year. This year, a particularly high figure in relation to transfers out, £20 million, and transfers in is around 5.3 million. And over the year, the kind of the point to all of this, over the year, just short of £65 million worth of pensions were actually paid out. The annual report itself is split into a number of different sections, which gives details of the financial investments of the employers, the contributions, and there is a series of statements behind that setting out all of the particular issues and key fundamental working parts of the pension fund, which are there for information and assurance to all of our pensioners and the contributors and employers into that. I'm not going to go through the actual financial statements in any detail, but we are happy to take any questions on those detailed financial statements should they be necessary. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Roger.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to add my thoughts to James and congratulate his team and everybody else involved in getting it where we are with it for it. But I do have a question. Shropshire Council has a policy about climate change, and I see it's mentioned in 6 and 8. In 6 it says doesn't make decisions, and 8 it makes a brief mention about climate change. Is it a strategic risk or not? There's no definition of it, whether it's accepted as a risk for the pension fund or not. Many would say it is. We heard some questions at the start of the meeting that there is an opinion widely held, maybe not majority, but it is widely held that there is a risk for it, but there is no mention anywhere in their reports to follow through what Shropshire Council's policy is. And I know this is a pension for far wider than Shropshire Council, but these are prepared by, and Shropshire Council is heading on it. And I wonder why there isn't anything about looking at climate change and any risk there is in the future mentioned in them, especially in 6, and also as it is there in 8. There is a request policy from Shropshire Council that there should be some report in all reports that are done saying about climate risk and climate change and making comments on it, but I can't see it in either of these reports. So does it need to be included sometime in the future or not? Because it is there, and is it a risk or isn't it a risk, and what is the policy going to be? I know we're going to make the decision in November, but it isn't mentioned here at all. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to take that. So, yeah, just to kind of clarify a number of things there you said, Councillor. So, the Shropshire County Pension Fund is independent of Shropshire Council, but nevertheless, Shropshire Council is the administering authority. So, this committee is a committee of Shropshire Council, but the work that's undertaken by this committee relates to the pension fund and is not then managed or directed by the local authority. So in terms of the reporting is produced by Shropshire Council. We have a standard reporting mechanism, and within the covering reports we identify the climate change appraisal. Those climate change appraisals in those covering reports relate to the covering report themselves. What they don't do is pick up the underlying risks associated with, in this case, Shropshire County Pension Fund. So what we do have within the annual report is reference to ethical and sustainable governance and risks associated with that. We have risk registers for the pension fund, and climate change, although we've identified it as probably, well, not probably, as the most significant risk that the pension fund is facing. Nevertheless, it is just one of a series of risks that are all being managed. So the investment strategy, the approach that we undertake to managing the pension fund in itself takes account of all of the risks associated with that, of which climate change is one. So I think the point is well made in terms of, do we draw out enough in relation to what the fund is actually doing in relation to climate risk? I would argue back in relation to that, that the amount of work and the amount of training and the amount of discussion that has dominated the pension committee meetings for the last, well, more than the last 12 months, I would argue that there's no question that the committee and the pension fund is taking that risk very, very seriously.
Yes, Mr. Buffett.
Thank you, Chairman. I will draw attention to 6.4, which is on page 3 of item 6, which says internal audit operates a strategic risk-based plan, and that's why I refer to it here, and also 8, that it doesn't appear anywhere in it or make any mention of it. So that's partly the reason. But whilst I'm talking, Chairman, can I say, and I did write to you, Chairman, that I do have concerns about item 17 on today's agenda. I'm not satisfied, and I'll say it now, that it should be an exempt item. It is there, but maybe we can talk about it later.
We can, and actually you did write to me, you actually copied me in, so you actually wrote to the offices. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Any other? Yes, Laura.
Hello, I have 3, I hope, quite short questions. The first one, it mentions that we lost 20 million in transfers out of the scheme. I was wondering, is that to do with privatisation of council work, or if there's a reason behind it, whether it's something we need to be worried about, or we need to maybe put weight behind Shropshire Council to imagine maybe it's lodged in the Shropshire Council because it's the major component. Do we need to talk to them about what has happened, why it's happened, and how it's impacted us.
There'd be someone for you, perhaps.
I can pick that up. Laura, sorry, sat behind me. Transfers out will pick up a number of things. So it would pick up outsourcing if we have to transfer money to different parts of the funds. Mainly, it will pick up transfers out to other funds, so either other local government funds or to personal occupational schemes elsewhere when people have just transferred jobs. So it's more likely to be people transferring on jobs. So we will get transfers in as well. Usually you hope that they'll balance each other out. So that's the answer.
Yeah, so I think this year, or this quarter, what it was, we lost 20 and gained, I think it was 5. Is that a normal discrepancy, or is this just a one-off that we shouldn't really necessarily worry about?
I think it's probably more an indication of that we may have lost more offices elsewhere with longer serving members that may have had a bigger transfer than the ones we gained. So yeah, over the long term, you would hope to balance it out, but it's not an exact science.
Thanks, Debbie.
And 2 more questions.
Sorry. In the report, it talked about LGPS Central moving more slowly than we hoped in terms of getting set up. Is that something we need to be worried about? Is it something we can put pressure on? Do we still want to continue down this path if they're not performing as we hoped? I know we're part of the central board, but
yeah, thank you, Laura. Yeah, so today we've got probably about 12% of our fund has transferred to LGPS Central in on their active global equity funds. This next 6 to 12 months is going to see a significant transfer of assets. So we've just recently committed 120 million into the LGPS Central's private debt fund, a further 65 million into the LGPS Central's infrastructure fund, and later on this year, early next year, when the fund's been launched, the targeted return fund, we've currently got over 500 million in these type of strategies. So that's obviously subject to the tender being completed, and that's due to transfer later this year, early next year. So I think we're going to go from a position of around about 12% of assets being transferred to up to 70% of our assets. So there's been a significant shift. You know, now products are available that Shropshire want to invest in.
And final question, Laura.
This is probably a very tiny one. We're talking about risks of COVID and staff working from home, and one of the things we were concerned about was IT outages and internet shortages. Is this something that we can look at to support those members? Can we have more reliable internet to their homes or something like that to facilitate and reduce that risk?
Thank you, Joe. I'll take that one. In terms of home working, in terms of the reliability of the network, and all the associated elements of that. Certainly from the point of view of Shropshire Council, we are reviewing and investing in that area to ensure that is working. In terms of individual circumstances and could we help out with people's individual broadband or whatever, that's something that we've looked at. It's not something that we've made a decision on one way or another. At the moment we haven't moved in that direction at all. But it is something that's been raised a number of times, and is something that we continue to look at. So fundamentally, we are aiming to support all of our staff to work in the best way that they can, and encouraging remote and home working where that is possible.
Thank you.
Any more questions, please? Well, I think I would just like to ask that it's minuted that the whole pensions committee we'd just like to congratulate the pensions team on a terrific achievement this year. I was really, really impressed with reports, and bearing in mind we've gone through one of the worst pandemics in living memory with our staff working from home. It's looking at it from an outsider. All this has been achieved in a really seamless fashion, and to continue distributing £65 million in pensions is a fantastic achievement. And I would just like to thank all our officers. Please pass it on to all our staff how pleased we are. And we would just like to congratulate them all. Moving on to the recommendations, Councillor Brian Williams has proposed them. They're 2 tranches, which I'll read out. Can I have a seconder, please? Yep, Roger Evans. And I'll just read out the decisions we're about to vote on. The first one is paper 6. The committee are asked to consider and endorse with appropriate comment. A, performance against the audit plan for the year ending 31st of March 2021. B, the head of audit's substantial year-end opinion on the fund's internal control environment for 2021 is based on the work undertaken. Assurance from the employer in respect of compensating controls within their financial reconciliation systems, whilst a long-term solution is delivered and pension fund management response is received. And the other recommendations in agenda item 8, 2.1, the committee is asked to approve the pension fund annual report, and 2.2, the committee is asked to approve that the chair and executive director of resources sign the letter of representation for Grant Thornton. All those in favour, please. No one against. Very, very good. Thank you very much. We'll just take a few moments, shall we, to sign now, or should we do it later? We'll do it later. Okay. The next item on the agenda is a presentation from Mr. Patrick O'Hara from LGPS Central on responsible investment and engagement. So over to you.
I'm sorry to butt in, Chair.
Yes.
Just quick toilet break.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Please do. Please do, and we'll continue.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. We're delighted to be here. The presentation has my face on the front of it, but it is going to be a joint effort between me and colleagues, so I apologise for the lack of representation on the slides. So, as I said, we're going to talk to you today about responsible investment and how we approach it at LGPS Central. Happy to take questions at any point during the presentation, particularly if we slip into jargon and acronyms and things like that, which we do have a tendency to do. So I'm going to do an introduction to RI&E, and then we'll go into talking about how we approach it and how we work with Shropshire. We're going to talk, my colleague Val is going to talk about engagement and voting. Then we're going to have a discussion on, or presentation on net zero and the net zero asset owner framework put forward by IIGCC. My colleague Laura is going to talk about the Shropshire climate strategy. And then we're going to present 2 product developments that we're working on at the moment. So the Global Active Sustainable Equity mandate, and the investment director responsible for that, Mark Davis, is going to talk about that. And then my colleague David Evans is going to talk about his climate multi-factor fund and the work he's doing with index providers to look at various alternatives for future product development. And then we'll have some conclusions and next steps. So if I can start just by talking about responsible investment generally and what it is and what it isn't. So responsible investment is not predicated on moral or ethical judgments. Our approach is based on materiality and the belief that environmental, social and governance factors can be material to investment performance. And therefore it's entirely in keeping for us to insist those factors are integrated into the investment process and considered when valuing companies and making investment decisions. It's based on materiality, so we focus on material issues. To the next box there, responsible investment has a negative impact on investment performance. Academic research shows that overwhelmingly that integrating ESG into your investment process does not have a negative impact. You can reduce the negative impacts and footprint of your portfolio without compromising investment returns And there's also lots of evidence to suggest that your investment returns will be enhanced by doing this. Also, a very important element of ESG integration is avoiding downside risks. So, as we've talked about today, there are various risks such as climate change and other environmental and social risks that present risks to corporates and risks to our portfolio. So it's an integral part of investment risk analysis. And it's also really important for identifying investment opportunities. The transition to a lower carbon economy is going to throw up lots of opportunities for investors that they need to take advantage of. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. So another common fad put about responsible investment, another misconception about responsible investment is that it's a fad, it's a short-term trend that will play out. And that's clearly not the case. It's going to be increasingly important that you integrate these factors into your investment processes, that you behave like responsible stewards when engaging with companies, and you use your vote at AGMs. And we've seen an enormous shift of assets under management into ESG mandates. The Principles for Responsible Investment now has over 100 trillion of assets assigned to it. And there's over 30 trillion assets that are actually being managed using ESG data. So it's an overwhelming trend that's become mainstream. Increase those global commitments to tackle climate change increase. And the other factor that is often, people think that responsible investment and ESG integration is about exclusions. And it's far more than exclusions. It's about really analysing the companies and understanding the risks and opportunities that they have, and setting up portfolios accordingly. And overall, the key message from this slide really is that if you're not integrating ESG, and you're not acting as a good steward, you're probably not fulfilling or delivering on your fiduciary responsibilities as an investor. And that's a conviction that we have at LGPS Central. So just to give some background on what kind of issues are covered by the term ESG. So under the environmental pillar on slide 5 there, it covers carbon emissions, obviously, but it also covers shorter term ESG risks, environmental risks such as water stress, biodiversity, and pollution and waste. And under the social pillar, it covers issues such as labour management, health and safety, supply chain risks such as child labour and modern slavery. And under governance, it covers business ethics and corporate behaviour, board diversity, executive pay, and transparency. And that's not an exhaustive list. These issues vary in terms of their materiality from sector to sector, and we tend to try and focus on the material issues per sector. And just when I first started working in this industry, these issues were described as non-financial or extra financial factors, and that's no longer the case. They're regarded as being integral to the financial analysis of a company. So moving on to slide 7, just to talk about how we approach responsible investment at LGPS. We'll go into a bit more detail, but this slide gives an overview of how the team is constructed and how we organise our work. So you can regard this as what we do before we invest and what we do after we invest. So before we invest, it's all about selection and due diligence. So it's making sure that the companies, the external managers that we appoint, firstly and foremostly, hold the same conviction as we do about the importance of responsible investment, the importance of stewardship, the potential impact of engagement and voting, and that they have the people, processes and systems to deliver on all of these expectations, and that they're able to fulfill our expectations with regard to how they integrate ESG into their investment processes. And we have an internal certification called RI Integrated Status, which we're going to talk about in a little more detail, a few slides after this. But that's how we get satisfaction that, across the organisation, we've appointed the right external managers. So that's really on the assets that we manage externally, so the fixed income and the active equity portfolios and our private markets and infrastructure assets. But on the internally managed portfolios, so the passive portfolios, that are tracking benchmarks. It's all about making sure that they're set up so that we can vote those companies, so that they're integrated into our stewardship program, so that we're engaging with those companies where appropriate. And we're also involved in the development and analysis of climate risk. For example, like the Climate Multi-Factor Fund that we talked about earlier, the RI team has input into those product developments. And all of this is covered in the IMA and the side letter when we appoint external managers. So we have an agreement from the outset of our expectations. And then after the investment, it becomes about stewardship, and we split stewardship into a couple of different components. One of them is the ongoing monitoring of our external managers, so making sure that they continue to deliver on our expectations. The engagements that we do with corporates, both directly ourselves and collaboratively with other investors, and Valborg is going to talk a bit more in detail about that. And then voting, so making sure that our voting policy is kept up to date, reflects the beliefs and the interests of the partner funds. And where possible and where appropriate, we will co-file shareholder resolutions, and we've done that in the past, and we will do that again in the future. So moving on to the RI integrator status and manager monitoring. My colleague Laura Mickey, who's online, will talk about that.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I hope everyone can hear me all right.
Yes, we can.
Great. That's great. So good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Mickey. I'm part of the RI&E team as a junior analyst. And I'm just going to take you through how we approach manager monitoring at LGPS Central, including our responsible investment integrated status, which currently covers 100% of our funds. So I'm going to run through what this is, how this works in practice, and how this ties back to our monitoring activity. So if you could just turn to slide 9. The RIIS stands for Responsible Investment Integrated Status, and essentially it is a ranking that our portfolios aim to achieve. So it covers all our LGPS Central funds, from the equity funds to fixed income and private equity. Everything is covered by the RIIS. And to achieve this status, there must be in place a document which explains how RI is integrated into the day-to-day running of that portfolio. So essentially, these documents ensure that RI is fully and properly incorporated into every aspect of our investment management. So how this works in practice is that the RI&E team and the relevant asset class team jointly draft a suggested way in how RI should be incorporated and managed within that specific asset class. And these documents are split into 4 main sections, which you can see listed on the circular diagram on the slides. So firstly, we have the responsible investment beliefs, and these are our guiding principles. So it will include things such as the belief that RI is supportive of risk-adjusted returns, or that a strategy of engagement rather than exclusion is more compatible with fiduciary duty. And it's really these beliefs that then steer how we integrate RI into both the selection and stewardship of our investment products. So as part of the selection, the RI integrated status document will outline how RI is incorporated into the SQs, the RFPs, and then when we choose the external managers. And the stewardship section will describe how we then monitor those managers for RI once they are appointed. And lastly, we have transparency and disclosure, and this relates to our internal and external reporting to partner funds. So once this document is fully drafted, it receives approval from the investment committee, who will approve it if they are confident that the process is being enacted within that asset class. And once this approval is given, that portfolio will then have achieved its RI integrated status, alongside the knowledge that RI is being properly practiced within that portfolio. So essentially, the RI integrated status just provide confidence both to yourselves and to us that responsible investment is being taken seriously and is fully incorporated into all of our investment products. So I'll just spend a bit more time diving slightly deeper into the selection and monitoring aspects of the RIIS, and so you can really understand what we do in this space. If you could just please turn to slide 10. So in the selection, appointment and monitoring of external managers, what we refer to as the SAM approach, I'm just going to begin with the selection part. Now, the manager selection typically has 3 broad stages: the selection questionnaire, the request for proposal, and the manager meetings. And RI assessments are undertaken at each one of these stages. So within the SQ, the selection questionnaire is used to determine how RI factors are incorporated into the manager's investment process. Here we would usually include an RI question, which is given around 10% weighting. And following this, in the next stage, the Rfp stage, this stage really allows us to go or get a deeper dive into the manager's ESG practices. And again, we usually have 1 or 2 RI&E questions, and we often ask them how to give a specific stock example, which demonstrates how RI is integrated into their process. So really, this stage is moving beyond a description of the manager's process, which is covered in the SQ stage, and into a more kind of actual implementation of their process within a live example. Then the final part of the selection process is where the managers have been narrowed down to just a few, normally ranging between 4 and 6, and we hold manager meetings, which the RI&E team participate in. We then ask the managers a number of detailed questions to ensure that they've answered what they told us in the previous 2 stages is actually what they do. And it's in this stage where it becomes clear if a manager is actually taking ESG seriously. Once the managers have been selected, responsible investment stipulations are included in the legal documents with external managers, as Patrick said earlier. So this includes explicit reference to RI&E in the investment management agreement. After the external managers have been selected and appointed, the final stage in the SAM approach is the monitoring of these managers. And if you could please turn to slide 11. So managers are monitored every quarter by the relevant investment team and the RI&E team. So each manager is required to complete data templates, which we do design, and these cover key areas such as ESG integration, stewardship data, and climate risk. And during these quarterly meetings, we would then ask managers questions on any of the topics within those Excel templates or any other information that we would like some clarity on. And really based on their answers, we would then rate them on an internal traffic light system. So on this slide, we have some examples of how we monitor the managers. These examples are from the LGPS Central Global Equity Active Multi-Manager Fund, which Shropshire is invested in. So on ESG integration, we may ask a manager about their investment thesis for a certain stock. So as you can see on the slide, I've included an example of Glencore, which is from the Harris portfolio. And Glencore is a long-term high conviction holding for Harris Associates. And because they have around 4 to 5% of their portfolio invested in this stock, their thermal coal exposure is higher than the benchmark. So as this could be a potential ESG risk, this is the type of thing we would then bring up on those quarterly calls. We would ask them for updates on their Glencore analysis, ask them for further justification behind their conviction, or ask them to ensure that any ESG risks are being properly managed by Harris. We also review managers' climate risk. So one example of this is that we review their carbon footprint every quarter. So if you look at the bottom right-hand side of the slide, you can see that Union's carbon footprint throughout 2019 and 2020. And it has been consistently below the benchmark, which is encouraging to see. And again, if something was out of place within this data, we would then bring this up in the quarterly meetings to discuss it with the manager. And finally, every quarter, we also review the external manager's engagement activity. So at LGPS Central, we have a strong belief that engagement with companies is key to driving change. And so we have to remain up to date of what our managers are doing on this front as well. So I'm now going to pass over to Val. I believe he's going to be talking through the engagement and voting.
Just thank you, Laura, for that. And that's really important because it's an integral part of our proposition that ESG integration added with stewardship is a solution that's going to lead to the best outcomes for us as investors and the best outcomes for society in terms of changing corporate behaviour. And this is half of that equation. So thank you for that.
Chair, sorry, can I ask a question of clarification while we're on this last slide? So where we just had the graph with climate risk and the benchmark. So how is the benchmark set? Just because I don't really understand that.
Yeah, sure. So it is the performance benchmark that the fund manager is managing the portfolio against, and his investment performance is judged against.
So but how do you determine what is a good benchmark?
Well, from the outset, that's agreed with the investors and the company. So it depends on the geographical location of the portfolio. So if it's an emerging market portfolio, it would be the MSCI World Emerging Market portfolio. So that's an investment decision in terms of understanding how we're going to measure and monitor the investment performance of the fund manager. So what does outperformance look like? What does underperformance look like? That's what the benchmark is there.
So we as investors would have a say in what that benchmark
yes,
is.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an integral part when the fund is launched. That benchmark is a very careful decision that's taken.
And I suppose I'm just then looking at James, would we not then be looking to see carbon footprints reducing rather than, because that's a pretty blipped bit and then come up again, it's a flat line, isn't it? It's kind of finished where it started off. Would we not want to see reductions in carbon footprints?
Well, there's always going to be a correlation between the portfolio that is being managed against that benchmark and the benchmark itself in terms of constituents of the portfolio and the constituents of the benchmark. So they probably will move in tandem for a large proportion of the time. And what we're trying to monitor is to make sure with this particular approach that the portfolio is carrying less climate risk, less carbon risk than the associated benchmark. So to the extent that carbon footprint indicates climate risk, carbon footprinting as a discipline indicates climate risk. You know, we take some comfort from the fact that we're carrying less climate risk than the benchmark is.
It's probably too much for today, but I think at some point I'd quite like to understand a little bit more about how that benchmark comes about, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day.
If I may, Chair, I think the other thing to point out is that that benchmark is shown over a very short period of time.
Yeah.
You will get quarterly variations that impact on that. I think probably what would be helpful would be to see potentially what that benchmark looks like over a longer period of time, because I think that's the point that you're getting to.
The downward trend.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question as well on ESG evaluation? On the multi-manager, the global equity multi-manager fund, it's quite possible that occasionally a particular share could appear both, say, Harris's portfolio and, say, Union's portfolio. Do their ESG evaluations ever vary? You've got two managers looking at the same company. Do their evaluations vary, or do they tend to sort of agree?
No, that can happen. I mean, they're actively managed portfolios, and the fund managers are looking to beat the market, so they will take contrarian views, and that's why they'll select stocks, because they have a different view on the value of that company. So they could definitely differ. Those two portfolios are slightly different. One's an active equity portfolio. The other one is a multi-factor fund, which doesn't have a fund manager kind of element to it. It's the stocks are selected based on the application of the model, the factor model, with certain constraints around climate also applied. So yeah, they won't. They're different beasts, basically.
Yes, Simon.
Yeah, it's an interesting thesis being Glencore, and I just want to make a little bit further explanation of how 80% of the value lies in presumably Glencore providing environmentally positive opportunities. I mean, it's a mining company.
Yeah, it is a mining company, but it has copper and cobalt. They're very important parts of their asset base and their portfolio mix. Cobalt is going to be, and is very much in demand in terms of electric vehicle batteries, and copper is utilised across a number of renewable energy solutions. So, I mean, anybody who holds Glencore at the moment will obviously be very aware of the risks to their coal assets, but also cognizant of the upside associated with those metals.
Okay, so those metals are seen as the future of a reduced carbon environment, and therefore going back to Glencore, investing in Glencore is seen as a good thing, because through that investment we reach a reduced carbon environment. Is that the? Yeah,
that's right. And just to add a bit of flavour to that, Glencore set a target for basically exiting coal, thermal coal. What date was it? Was it 20?
Sorry, they've set a reduction target of 50% by 2035, and then come 2050 net zero.
Oh, in terms of the coal, the coal.
That is the coal
I thought it was more aggressive than that.
That is the coal exposure. That is the, that will be reduced.
Okay, thanks.
So we're expecting the company to transition basically away from fossil fuels to more of these products.
Future product elements, or whatever you call them.
Precisely, yeah.
Thank you. Byron's got a question, please, Byron.
I was just thinking from North Carolina at the climate risk graph. On it, you said that they were sort of slightly below. Well, if that's the case, maybe it might be worth in the future looking at setting the target higher, because if you're always below it, set the target lower. So if you're always below it, you've got nothing to aim for. Just sort of thinking out of that.
Yeah, there is no target for this portfolio in terms of either carbon reduction that it is required to achieve, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And there's also no target for the amount that it must be under the portfolio. The reason the Harris portfolio performs well against the benchmark in terms of carbon is because they don't invest in certain high emitting sectors, such as utilities. But there is no boundaries or limits on the extent to which they could get closer to the benchmark in terms of their carbon exposure. We just take comfort from the fact, and we monitor the portfolio and take comfort from the fact that it is more carbon efficient than the benchmark.
Yes, back to the presentation.
Yes, Val
next.
Sorry, thank you. I just thought I'd try to face the committee both ways, right? So over to engagement and voting. Slide 13 of the pack. The headline says, does engagement work? And we often get that question. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to cover what we do, what we discuss with companies and other stakeholders, and the progress that we see. But I guess taking a step back is, why do we engage? So I would say as a starting point that engagement is both a choice and a responsibility. So RGPS Central, we represent Shropshire Pension Fund and the other pension funds who are stewarding long-term assets. You don't get much longer term than a pension fund. So we engage to help safeguard and grow the assets and encourage corporate practices where ESG factors that Patrick just mentioned, environmental, social and governance issues, will need to be managed well. And then the responsibility aspect, that we have a duty to be responsible owners. This is now very clearly enshrined in the revised UK Stewardship Code, and we sit, shall we say, at the top of the food chain, so asset owners can influence both asset managers and companies in holding them to account. I would say that engagement is not hunting, it is farming. So you need to have some patience, you need to be strategic, and we always look for collaborative partners, and I'll come to that in a minute. So we have an eye on the long game, but we're still ambitious, and we will persistently ask for
good governance, strong climate risk management, and social responsibility. So on the right-hand side, you can see some logos of companies that we've either engaged directly over the last period or where we have voted for shareholder proposals that have set the stage for some, I would say, sea changes, very interesting movements. So one interesting trend just this AGM season is that companies put a climate transition plan to the AGM and they allow shareholders a vote on that plan. So we saw 18 companies do this, and this is a very recent trend. So mostly European companies, some oil and gas, some mining, and we also saw a couple of Canadian companies. All of those plans were passed, and it was somewhere in the region of 88% support to near 100% support. And there are certain companies that keep coming up in conversation, Shell, BP, etc. Shell was one company that put forward a climate transition plan to the AGM, and it passed with 88.7% support. We, LGPS Central, on behalf of our partner funds, actually voted against the plan. That is not because we don't believe the company can transition, but we want to hold their feet to the fire, so to speak. So we want to see them have more robust short and medium term targets. We also want to tease out the reliance on what's called CCS, carbon capture and storage.
Roger, did you want to ask a question? So sorry about that.
Only briefly, Chairman, and that is there any time scale to these plans? Does that reflect anywhere? Because if it's 2030, 2050, 2080, one can always put a change in, but how enthusiastic are you, and is it possible that you can bring it forward?
In terms of our engagement horizon, or in terms of what we ask of companies? In
these companies that we are investing in, so they put climate change as a target they're going to come out, like Glencoe and the time there. What sort of time scale is it? Does that reflect in the their rating as whether we want to continue or whether we want to push them to do it more rapidly?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. So what LGPS Central is part of a collaboration called Climate Action 100+, and that was set up in 2017. It's got a 5-year horizon, and a key ask there is for all companies. The companies in that are in scope of that project they are responsible for 80% of industrial emissions globally. So we've got 160 companies across oil and gas, but also the demand side, auto, shipping, aviation, cement, paper, etc. So these companies are being asked to set a net zero by 2050 and align with Paris. Right now we're discussing, in light of the recent report from the International Energy Agency that has done a scenario on net zero by 2050 and a 1.5 temperature rise. So we're trying to bake that in as well. So we are sharpening our expectations, and it's not just sufficient to set a 2050 ambition, net zero 2050 ambition, but to spell out how will that translate into short-term targets, medium-term targets, and actions to be taken. So we've just launched this year a climate risk benchmark through this climate action project that is assessing companies on 10 indicators. It's quite specific and it's public, so it's a bit of a nowhere to hide situation, and it allows investors leverage to push those to be considered laggards. Right, so if we move on to slide 14, collaboration is key. We value it and we seek it. It gives more clout, we are more efficient, we can share the burden between investors, and we'll have greater chance of achieving engagement objectives. So you see a handful of logos on that slide. I won't go into all of those, but just to say that we seek collaborations that help promote stewardship themes, which I'll come into in a minute, and that encourage both strong corporate governance. It could be on, for instance, gender diversity, and then climate risk management is also a key element here. I want to mention policy engagement as well, because we talk quite a lot about company engagements, but alongside that, we need to also encourage market developments that can be conducive to achieving Paris alignment. So we actively, alongside other investors again, engage policymakers in the UK, EU leaders. For instance, now during COVID, we've sent letters asking for a green recovery from the pandemic. And ahead of COP26, which is a big climate summit in Glasgow in November, we have asked for acceleration of commitments and domestic policies to deliver net zero by 2050, and this will help both investors and companies. Moving on to slide 15. So to help us stay targeted and efficient in our engagement efforts, we've identified some key stewardship themes that will be the focus over a 3-year horizon. So we've got climate change, plastic pollution, responsible tax behaviour, and technology and disruptive industries. So these were identified through a democratic process with Shropshire and the other pension partner funds. Were ultimately deciding which themes we should pursue and prioritise, and we were looking across the spectrum of themes where we thought there was an economic relevance, risks and trends that are material to investment objectives over a long-term investment horizon, also which themes have high stakeholder attention, and then we also assessed our ability to collaborate, because like I said, we can achieve a lot more when we find collaborative partners to put our expectations across. So I just want to quickly mention an engagement with the tech sector. So we've got social media companies like Facebook and Twitter that we've over 2 years engaged on social media content control to stop hate speech and objectionable content, etc. And to be honest, initially it was very hard to get them in the room. And you've got, let's take Facebook as an example. Mark Zuckerberg is both CEO and chair, and minority shareholders can perhaps be ignored. But fortunately, we've got some traction. More than 100 investors have started backing this project. So last year, we've got meetings with Facebook, with Twitter, and they've taken some encouraging steps. These are complex issues, but our main ask is that they have good governance in place, but also tools to stop hate speech, to stop objectionable content from being posted, or if it was posted, removed immediately. So Facebook has an oversight board in place. They have human rights risk training for staff. They have also become much more transparent about this set of risks and how they're tackling it. So that is promising.
Do you mind if I ask for a point of clarification? When you talk about we, are you talking about LGPS Centre, or are you talking about all the other 9 pension local authority pension funds that are similar to LGPS Centre?
So when I say we, I mean LGPS Central on behalf of Shropshire Pension Fund and the other partner funds of LGPS Central. I know you're talking about partner funds, but LGPS Central is only one of 8 or 9 bodies nationally that are cooperatives of pension funds, of council pension funds. Are the, as far as you know, are the other bodies similar to LGPS engaging in this way? Yes, they are. So the other pools, we sit on a group that has been established for the purpose of making sure that we discuss and we lever off each other. So we have a cross-pool RI working group that meets quarterly, and several of our sister pools take part in these engagements. Yeah.
So naturally, the pools are doing as much or engaging as strongly as LGPS centres.
I think that's a fair observation. I think perhaps each of them would, be able to explain exactly what they're doing, but we are seeking alignment, and we are seeking to have a stronger voice on, for instance, climate change. And I think all the pools, as far as I'm aware, are also quite transparent. You know, we will publish material to show engagement, voting, etc. on websites. And what I want to say is that collaboration is not just UK. Just the other day, I spoke to a Dutch pension fund, and we are collaborating, or New Zealand, New Zealand Super, or Canada. So and in these virtual times, it's actually sometimes easier to get meetings, and maybe companies are also more receptive. The threshold is lower for the CEO or the chair to take a virtual meeting, which is an interesting development.
Thank you for that clarification.
Right.
If I may say just very, very quickly, when members are asking questions, can you please remember to use your mics? Apparently the sound doesn't come through very well without that. Thank you.
I apologise.
Right, I'll try to round off the engagement and voting section here. So there is a lot of when we talk about climate risk, there's a lot of attention on the fossil fuel companies, the providers of energy from fossil fuels, but we have to also look at the demand side, and we have to look at the other actors in the wider chain. So we are engaging the banking sector, and in 2020 we collaborated with other investors, including one of the other pools, by the way, to co-file a shareholder proposal to Barclays and asking them for a net zero commitment by 2050 and to set targets for how to achieve that. So I would say it was at times discussions that were quite heated. The chair of the company engaged directly with us, but in the end, at their AGM, they had just set a net zero by 2050 target. They acknowledged the investor dialogue as very positive, as constructive, and it's not, the AGM is one point in time where you can exchange views and put forward resolutions, but then we have put a lot of effort into continued dialogue. How is that net zero target going to be translated into shorter term targets and actions? And we're also engaging other banks on the same issue. Just to finish off, slide 17, to briefly touch on another issue. This is modern slavery. It falls outside of our stewardship themes, but we do engage broadly when we see that there is this is a very clear, strong collaborative engagement project, clear goals, and as you can see on the slide, it has had two phases. The main, should we say, targets of this engagement are FTSE 350 companies, and we've asked for them to comply with the Modern Slavery Act, and we've had very, very high success with it. And then the next step will really be to then tease out, one thing is being compliant with the Modern Slavery Act, but then is how does that happen on the ground? And just a few months back, we had an engagement with a UK retailer that seems to be taking a really robust and holistic approach, and they started looking at, you know, climate change gets a lot of attention, but they broaden that to encompass human rights risks and modern slavery. So very positive to see. Thank you. Back to Patrick.
Yes, thank you, Velma. I think one of the key things we want to get across to you today is that our approach to this is that we very much think of ourselves as owners of these companies. We have a long-term view, and therefore climate change is material to us in terms of how we engage with the company and the risks that we assess. Not all investors react in that way or think in that way, and it's important, it's critical at this time that these companies have owners that do care about these issues and are prepared to take a long-term view and engage and hold management to book on how they're dealing with the transition to a lower carbon economy and how they take the interests of other stakeholders beyond shareholders into view when they're making setting strategy and making decisions. So is there a question there?
Yeah, I can see some really positive examples of where engagement has actually made some great turnarounds, certainly at board level and things like that. What do you do when a company fails to engage with you? There's a couple of examples much later in the pack we haven't got to yet where you've asked for things and they haven't turned up. What do you do at that stage? At what point do you go, this isn't working?
Yeah, sure. It depends on what market you're engaging with. I can remember when I first tried to engage with Chinese companies, speaking to the fund manager that held the stock, and they basically said, well, there's no point because they won't speak to you. And I took the view that, well, if we don't start having the conversation, we're never going to make any progress, and we're never going to get them used to engaging or speaking with investors on such issues. And so that's a slow game, and you have to expect in certain markets that there are going to be challenges associated with that. In more developed markets, invariably they will speak to you. They won't always give you a comprehensive response. You keep banging at the door, and then at some point, if you reach the point where either you don't have confidence in management anymore, or the information that you're not getting your hands on is material to the investment case, then you have to factor that into the investment process. And ultimately, and this is going to be increasingly the case, you have to consider whether you should be invested in that company. And what I would say is that, there's a lot of talk about divestment. There are lots of companies that we don't hold in the portfolio that our investment managers haven't selected because they don't tick all the boxes in terms of the investment case, and some of those factors are ESG related. So there's to a certain extent there is divestment already happening before people have invested. And I spoke to a fund manager the other day, and admittedly they're on more of the sustainability side of things. They said they hold more in Zoom now than they do in fossil fuels. Just as an indication of how the indices are shifting from where they were very fossil fuel heavy to those companies being less significant in the index now, and to fintech and other pharmaceuticals and other industries becoming a bigger weight. So these things are being factored into the investment decisions.
That's really positive to hear. It's positive to hear that there's a reason for it, and there's a structure and a framework as to why people choose to select things. It's not just random on a fund manager. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. So yeah, just moving on to net zero. So this is a proposition that we've been working on internally at LGP Essential for some time now, and it's gone through various stages of discussion and approval. And it's based, our consideration of this is based on the IIGCC framework, a net zero framework for asset owners, and there's a similar one for asset managers. And we are engaging with our external managers to see what plans they have around net zero. And most of them are now members of the Asset Manager Net Zero Network. Many of them are considering their approach to this. They invariably want to make sure they completely understand how they would achieve this strategically before making a commitment or announcement to it. But it's very much a live conversation, and one that we welcome. So just by way of background, if we go to slide 19, earlier in the year, and this is something that the investment community was waiting on for a long time, the IEA produced a 1.5 degree or net zero scenario analysis. And this is something that the external scenario analysis providers and the banks have struggled to model, a credible scenario of how we can achieve or limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So this came out. It's been a very informative and helpful piece of work. It's quite sobering in terms of the trajectory of change that it envisages. Now, it is only a scenario. It's not a prediction of the future, and it's not the only possible scenario out there, but it is a comprehensive piece of work. So just to highlight some of the things that are brought out by the IEA scenario. So as we heard earlier, no new oil and gas fields or coal mines beyond 2021, no new unabated coal plants, and when we say unabated, we mean without the application of carbon capture and storage. 2030, 60% of global car sales need to be electric. We need to phase out unabated coal by 2030, and 2035, no new internal combustion engine car sales can take place. By 2040, 50% of aviation fuels need to be low carbon. And there are certain sectors like aviation and shipping, cement and steel that face real technological challenges associated with getting to a net zero. So these are the things that need to happen. These are the kind of tough decisions that companies need to be making over the next 5-10 years. It's a critical time. We need to accelerate the rate of change. And now strong leadership and strong ownership of these companies is essential. So moving on to the next slide, unless there's any questions at this point. Now, whilst that is...
Just give us a heading of each slide. I have no numbers.
Okay, sorry, apologise. So that one was LGPS Central, the climate transition. And now moving on to the next one in the slide deck, responsible investing, take advantage of opportunity and avoid risk. So whilst that is sobering, the IEA scenario, it does present lots of opportunities for investors. So the top of that slide there, the opportunities include, but not limited to, electrification, energy efficiency, carbon capture, utilisation and storage, hydrogen, green cement, sustainable steel, renewable energy. There are companies that are going to become winners out of this. They're going to show leadership, and as a result, their business model will be enhanced. But also they're going to be companies that struggle to transition and struggle with this innovation and change that's coming. And you're going to see risks such as stranded assets, litigation, regulation, supply chain disruption, water stress, physical risk and pollution become increasingly important in terms of the materiality of an impact on businesses and their share price. So there's opportunity and there's risk, but there's also opportunity cost. If you're an investor that's not aware of this transition and these opportunities, the relative performance of your investment portfolio will suffer. Just a couple of examples there. Christian Hansen at the top there is a company that has developed a bacteria that not only increases crop yield but reduces pesticide usage. So it's reducing the environmental impact of agriculture. And at the bottom there, Toso Corporation is a Japanese company that used to produce its own electricity with its own coal generation capacity. So they used to have cheap energy, which was a competitive advantage for them. But with the application of a carbon price, that competitive advantage could dissipate, and that could have implications for the balance sheet. And that's something that investors need to be cognitive of when analysing the company. So that's just an example of kind of the type of ESG analysis we're expecting from our external managers. And so then moving on to the next slide, which is slide 21, but is entitled LGPS Central, the Climate Transition. So as we can see from this chart, we can see that 73% of global emissions are covered by a net zero target or commitment. So that's not high enough, but it is some progress at least. And you can see the countries there, United States, China, European Union, have all made statements or commitments. But moving on to the next slide, and this is really important because this creates signals to which investors can react. When we get an idea of what future regulation is going to look like, it helps to make decisions around valuation, decisions about impacts on business models and sectors, and it helps to identify winners and losers. So government action is an imperative here. And then moving on to the next slide, which shows countries that have either achieved net zero, and there's two there, Suriname and Bhutan, which are very low emitters, but they have achieved net zero status. There are 11 others that have committed to a net zero target in law, Germany, UK, Japan. There are some others that are contemplating it, such as Ireland and Chile. But there are lots of other countries that haven't yet converted their policy statements or their commitments into law. And that's worrying because, as we know, with a change of government, and we could see this in the US, you can see a change of policy and a change of tactic. So China and the US have not yet put anything in law. Russia and India and Australia have been laggards in setting commitments around net zero. We want to get a position where countries can't go back on these commitments. So again, as part of the engagement that we're undertaking with governments, it's important that we push them to put this into law. So what does this mean, net zero, for us as investors? So the IIGCC framework suggests that at the moment, we should focus on 4 main asset classes: equities, corporate bonds, sovereign and real estate. And that's not to say that we will abandon doing anything with private markets. That's just parked for a little while to focus on these other asset classes. We've long seen an inertia in investment circles. The fact that we have not been able to do everything across all asset classes has sometimes stopped us from doing anything at all. So that's why private markets is put to one side for the moment. So the target, and this speaks to the question earlier on around targets and carbon footprinting. So the framework requires us to set targets for emissions reduction aligned to Paris, based on scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's the emissions associated with the operations of companies rather than the emissions of their products in use or supply chain. We would like to include scope 3 emissions, but we don't have the data for that. So the target is basically to achieve a 50% reduction in emissions associated with the portfolio by 2030 and to achieve net zero by 2050. And that equates to a 7.6% reduction per annum. There's also a target to have 70% of financed emissions in the fund or the portfolio in material sectors, either net zero already, aligned to a net zero pathway, or subject to a direct or collective engagement. And then that has to ramp up to 100% of material sectors in the portfolio. These targets are reviewed every 5 years, and performance against the targets is to be reported in a similar way to how we report on TCFD. So this means that, for example, if COP26, if the international community decides that there needs to be an acceleration towards net zero, targets can be amended accordingly, because that acceleration will be reflected in the behaviour of companies in the global economy, the companies that we invest in. Just moving on to the next slide. So just a few other points around the IIGCC net zero framework. So one is to challenge corporates on the use of their offsets. So as the name suggests, net zero doesn't mean that companies become zero emitting. It means that they get to a net zero position. So they reduce the emissions to the extent they can, and that needs to be a considerable amount. And we will hold them to book on that. And then the other challenge is that they will use offsets for those residual emissions that they can't abate. And that the calculations around those offsets are really important, i.e. that they really do achieve the sequestration of the right amount of carbon associated with the residual emissions of companies. And again, we will be engaging with companies on that. We've got a collaborative engagement going on at the moment with Brunel Pool and the Church of England around the corporate reporting of carbon emissions, which is a real concern in terms of the accuracy of the data that's being reported. We need this data to be absolutely accurate and the offsets to be calculated correctly. Otherwise, we've got no chance of achieving any of these targets. The framework also formulates a target towards, a target of allocation towards green technology. So we have a private markets team and an infrastructure team that are very closely looking at impact investing and very closely looking at opportunities in renewables. And this would require a more formal commitment. Unfortunately, there's lots of money chasing those opportunities, so that's a difficult space to invest in at the moment. But hopefully that will become easier as the net zero commitments get implemented into policy. Sovereign bonds are currently outside of the portfolio, but there's a lot of work going on to analyse at country level whether a country is on a net zero target, and then that will help you to assess whether the corporate bonds, the sovereign bonds of that country are on a net zero aligned trajectory. We need to set targets for engagement objectives, which to a large extent we've already done through Climate Action 100, etc. But we can draw those more closely into our assessment of portfolios and our analysis of portfolios, and directly our conversations with companies and external managers. And the same with aligning voting with a net zero framework. We already have that in place, and we will vote against companies if they don't cooperate with our engagement programme. We had an example earlier in the year of where we voted against the chairman because we weren't happy with the way they'd engaged with us on an issue. We won't be offsetting emissions within the fund. That's deemed to be not appropriate by the IIGCC framework, and we would agree with that. And it requires selective divestment. So talking to your point, if it's clear that a company in one of the portfolios we hold is not on a net zero aligned trajectory and they've got no chance of getting there, we'll have a very strong conversation with the external manager and potentially use our veto to say, well, this isn't consistent with our net zero target or your net zero target. So any questions on net zero? I mean, we are going to talk to some of the other partner funds about this as well as a potential solution and a potential strategy, and we think it has a lot of merit.
Yes, Karen.
Thank you. I mean, I understand the difficulties of scope 3. Scope 3 is a big part of emissions because it's what we consume, isn't it? That's a big area of emissions, and so unless we can understand scope 3 emissions, we can't get to net zero, and that's one of the big criticisms of the Paris Agreement, that it doesn't go as far as scope 3. So, I think that's a big challenge, and we've got to recognise that. I think the other thing was around, you so mentioned selective divestments, and I think that's useful that is in there. I think it is really important. But on the graph where you showed the kind of, the scale coming down in terms of carbon emissions and the steps we might get to net zero, one of the things that you said was around, no new coal, oil, gas by 2021. So clearly part of that engagement, if we're seeing from companies that they're still prospecting, they're still doing investing in exploration for new oil, gas, coal, then they're not meeting the commitments and the beliefs that we're setting out. So I would say that's the point where you go, okay, we absolutely vote with our feet and we pull out our investment because you're paying lip service to this. You're not actually doing what we think you need to do in order for us to reach that net zero.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things on that. The 2021 target is an IEA target. It's a scenario produced by IEA. It has no status in law or anything like that, and it's not an integral part of the IIGCC net zero framework. It is, an academic exercise as to this is one pathway to net zero. Now,
just interested, it does align with what the latest Ipcc that just says
yes,
that everything that's in the ground now, fossil fuel, needs to stay in the ground.
Yeah, yes, it does, and I think we have to reflect upon the fact that as to whether that is going to happen by the end of this year, I suspect it probably isn't, and we are having conversations with fossil fuel companies about that. The CA100 does pick up that as a point. And if we're not going to do it by 2021, we need to do it as soon as possible. And realistically, that is the conversation. Okay, if you're not going to do it in 2021, when are you going to do it? There are a couple of unintended consequences of doing that, what impact that would have on the oil price, on the coal price. I mean, we still have 1 billion people living in energy poverty, and 1 million people dying a year from burning biomass in their homes. So we need to reflect upon the fact that whilst this needs to be a very aggressive trajectory, we need to be realistic about when it's going to happen and what we can achieve in those conversations with those companies. Now, I truly believe that if we stop engaging with companies and these companies are held by investors that don't care, this will happen a lot later than if we do engage with them and encourage them to do this as soon as possible and as an accelerated approach. And I think we've got to reflect upon the fact we are owners. We're not speculators in their share price. We are owners. We do have influence over the strategy and the direction of the company, and we need to use that accordingly. And there was another point you raised, sorry.
I think you actually covered what I was raising.
Okay, maybe there was another point I was going to say, but if it comes back to me, I'll.
I mean, the other point was around the difficulties around scope 3. I was
so
you need to have an answer to that because.
No, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. There is estimated and modelled data around scope 3. I've had practice of doing analysis on modelled data in the past. When the real data comes through, it invariably shows the estimated data to be wrong. Scope 3 emissions, it varies per sector as to how important they are. For example, utilities, it's all scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it is relevant to analyse scope 1 and 2 emissions for those sectors. But in a lot of other sectors, the scope 3 emissions will outweigh the scope 1 and 2 by an enormous amount. What we are trying to focus on here, and this is also an important point, is focusing on the fossil fuel industry, focuses on the supply part of this problem, and the demand part of the problem is the rest of the economy using fossil fuels and to generate energy. And so that conversation of scope 1 and 2 emissions with those companies consuming that energy and encouraging them to be more efficient, use less of it to utilize carbon capture and storage, and to use renewables kind of addresses that demand side. So I think we will always have a fossil fuel industry whilst there's robust demand for their product. And if we can address the demand side as well as the supply side, I think we're going to get to a better outcome sooner.
I'd say there's a valid validity to that argument, but equally, you can also increase supply for alternatives by cutting off demand.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to encourage companies to decarbonise, and by 2 ways of doing that: energy efficiency and increased use of renewables. And Val and I engaged with a very large pharmaceutical company. They've set themselves a net zero target on their scope 1 emissions. It might be 1 and 2, but definitely scope 1 by 2025. So that's a real kind of aggressive target they've set themselves. And I do hope that they'll share that learning and that technology that they've developed in doing that with other companies. So, you know, that again, that's addressing the demand side of the equation. They've increased their renewable usage. They've become more energy efficient. So it's all part of what we're trying to achieve. Was there a question at the back? Sorry, Val, did you want to come in there?
Well, I'm just conscious of time as well, but on scope 3, I wanted to mention that we're active participants in something called the Transition Pathway Initiative, which is supported by London School of Economics, Grantham Institute. So you've got experts who sit and analyse companies, both in terms of how they manage climate risk, but also their trajectory. They call it their carbon performance against scenarios, including well below 2 degrees. So this is a tool. It's being built right now. They've been able to cover something like 400 companies, which does include scope 3. And there's ongoing discussions with the companies within sectors as well to make sure that they're, should we say, on board in how the methodologies are developed.
I am conscious that time is ticking. We're already on midday. We've got most of the agenda still to get to. So if we can sort of pick up on the
Yeah, Lord, do you want to speak briefly around the climate strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So as I'm sure all of you are aware of, at LGPS Central, we operate what's called a climate risk monitoring service. So just to provide a little bit of context, the Climate Risk Monitoring Service is a set of 4 services, all of which are designed to help our partner funds with their strategic response to managing climate risk. And the main deliverable of this service was the Climate Risk Report, which Shropshire County Pension Fund received last August/September. And one of our main recommendations from this report was for the fund to develop a standalone climate strategy document. So that's what I'm going to be briefly talking about in the next few slides. I'll try and keep it super short as we go along. So if we just turn to slide 26 on the structure. So the climate strategy is broadly split into 5 main sections. So it begins with the governance of climate change risks. It moves on to the fund's evidence-based beliefs relating to climate change. Thirdly, it covers the fund's objectives. The 4th section are the strategic actions. So this is the largest part of the strategy. And you can see on the slide as well, it's split into 5 subsections. And finally, the document finishes off with an annual review section. So I'll just talk through each one of these sections in the next few slides. If we move on to slide 27, background and context of the climate strategy. So just beginning with the purpose of this strategy is to explain Shropshire County Pension Fund's approach to addressing the risks and opportunities related to climate change. And what this strategy really does is bring together all those processes and actions that the fund are already undertaking in relation to climate change into one standalone document. So the first section covers the governance of climate change and describes the responsibilities of the different parties in setting, approving, implementing and reviewing the climate strategy. So at a very high level, the Pension Fund Committee is responsible for both the initial approval of the strategy and the subsequent biannual review, progress reviews, while the role of actually implementing the strategy falls to the scheme administrator and the head of Treasury and Pensions. The second section of the strategy covers the fund's evidence-based beliefs relating to climate change. And these really form the fund's guiding principles. And in total, the fund has 10 climate change beliefs, which range from the recognition that climate change is a financial material risk for the fund, to the understanding that investors play an important role in the transition to a low carbon economy. And just to note, the fifth climate change belief is that the fund provides support to the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. So the third section of the strategy relates to the fund's objectives. And these objectives are really the high level or holistic aims of the climate strategy. And as you can see in the bottom right hand box, these objectives are divided into three components, which are to identify, understand and assess risk opportunities, fund resilience, and policy advocacy and transparency. So this part of the strategy is very closely linked with the strategic action section, as it's this fourth section that describes the different actions the fund is and will take to achieve its climate objectives. If we just move on to slide 28, which covers the strategic actions. So as I said earlier, the strategic action section is the largest section in the climate strategy and describes the steps the fund is taking to achieve its objectives relating to climate change. And it covers kind of 5 broad areas, which are measurement and observation, asset allocation, selection, due diligence and monitoring, purposeful stewardship, and transparency and disclosure. So just in the interest of time, I will touch on just a few of these sections. So the strategic actions begin with the measurement and observations on climate-related risks and opportunities. So in practice, really, this relates to things like the climate risk report, which the fund receives annually, and it includes the carbon risk metrics for its listed equities. And a refresh will be delivered, I believe, in November, December this year. Another example would be the scenario analysis, which is a tool that the fund utilizes for the measurement of climate risk. And this is conducted on a biennial or triennial basis, with the most recent report received last year as part of the climate risk report. And just another example, for the fourth section, which is the purposeful stewardship. So here, the fund intends to develop a climate stewardship plan, which is to set clear goals of engagement with companies and fund managers. And again, this is currently in the works and is due to be published once it's received approval. And then just finally, it's not explicitly on this slide, but the climate strategy ends with an annual review section. So within this, it states that the strategy has a 3-year timeline to 2024. And in between that timeline, there are also annual reviews where the fund will look at the strategy and update any sections it believes needs updating. So sorry for that very quick run through, but happy to take any questions.
Just a key point to reiterate there is we'll do that climate risk monitoring service for you every year, and we'll keep abreast of evolution in terms of scope 3 emission and covering other sectors like private markets and credit, which coverage isn't great for at the moment. I think it's Mark talking about the new product that he's developing.
Thanks, Patrick. And thanks for that. So my name is Mark Davies. I head up the active equity team at LGPS Central. And as Patrick's just mentioned, we're building a new product for our partner funds in this space, a global sustainable active equity fund. As background, the partner funds came to us in October 2020 with this as their top priority. So you can see that this subject matter is across all our partner funds. If you move on to slide 30, the one that is entitled Global Sustainable Equity Funds, the investment spectrum covered. During our research beginning in October, we discovered that there is a full spectrum of capital and how managers in this space invest, how asset owners view sustainable investing. So we've built a model or a fund or a solution that will enable every partner fund, Shropshire included, to allocate their capital how they wish and how they view sustainable investing. So we have, which you're already members of, on the left, to the left of this spectrum, the Global Equity Fund, which you've heard integrates ESG into their investment processes. But we're moving across the spectrum now into that more sustainable area. So if we move on to the next slide, slide 31, we can see the way that we built this model. There's going to be 3 specific sleeves: a broad strategy, which will be a kind of a lower return area, more broad investment, but they're seeing ESG as an alpha source. They're looking for companies that are driving and have a sustainable edge over their other participants. There's certain areas in this where we would and companies and positions that we wouldn't expect to see from these managers. We then have the thematic approach, which is where fund managers will take a top-down approach and they will look at those big themes that are going to drive sustainable investing and sustainability over the next 10 years, 5, 10, 15 years and onwards. And then we have a strategy C, which is going to be more higher impact, and it will look to deliver the returns you require, but also the some sort of measurable incomes you can impact. So you can see what your investments are generating, the kind of like the net benefit they're saving to society. Slide 32 just delves into that a little bit more to give you some highlights. Like I said, the broad strategy also won't have none of these strategies at present, because we act on all partner funds have an exclusion policy, but as I've mentioned, there are positions that we wouldn't expect to see in these, one of them being actually fossil fuel investments. The reason for this is because these, as we've mentioned, these investment managers have processes and beliefs and philosophies that are aligned with what we're discussing with today, and they don't believe that there is the ability to drive long-term returns in these asset classes, so they won't hold them. There's no need for us to tell them not to hold them, because their own philosophy dictates that they are not an investable company for them, and that's across all sleeves, to be honest. To give you an update on where we are, we've just completed the final stage of the process. We've met with kind of like the top 3 managers in our view in each of these sleeves, and the team is currently working through which manager to award the mandate to. As mentioned, there is only going to be 1 manager per sleeve at this stage, but that is dependent on asset growth amongst our partner funds and the amount of capital they wish to deploy in this area. I'm open to questions if there are any. I know we're short on time, so if not, I'll pass on to David.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So just moving on to slide 34, I just really wanted to provide a very brief overview of our climate multi-factor fund, and I know some of you will have seen this fund before, but hopefully I'll be able to just provide a reminder of how it's worked or how it's structured. It's really an index or a passive style fund that we launched back in October 2019. And it's a fund that's really designed to do 2 things. First of all, it tracks an index that targets a range of style factors that are designed to outperform in the long run. And it does that in a very structured way But at the same time, it's really designed to help investors to address their sustainability requirements and their concerns around climate change. I think, as the team have very well have pointed out this morning, the importance of climate change and the impact on investments, and the need to embed those considerations across all asset classes, really, not just equities. It's become a key focus for many of our pension funds, including yourselves, and many funds are putting together their own climate strategies. So when it comes to climate and this fund, we feel that this is something that will fit in very well with that. It's a fund that's really designed to do three things. First of all, it provides a lower exposure to carbon emissions than the standard FTSE All-World Index, which is the standard market cap index that many investors are benchmarked against. It also reduces the levels of exposure to fossil fuel reserves, and we've talked a lot about that already this morning, but also where it comes to companies with green revenues, or companies that are generating revenue from cleaner forms of energy. They get to see their weight in this index increased. So it's a real positive adjustment towards these newer industries. And I think the second element to this fund, as we said, it has maximum exposure to those 5 style factors. We've got quality, value, momentum, low volatility, and size. And we're really pleased that we've now got 3 of your fellow pension funds who are invested in this fund, with assets of just under 3.5 billion. So we're really pleased that it's been very well received. And lastly, it's just a product that we think can be offered to capture these strategies in a very competitive, at a very competitive rate. Now, just turning over to slide 35, we talked about how this fund tracks an index that actively improves climate characteristics over the FTSE All-World Index. And I think this slide really illustrates the difference between the fund benchmark and the widely used FTSE All-World. And this is where we've really seen a significant improvement. At the end of last year, the climate characteristics within this benchmark were given even greater priority, with guaranteed minimum levels of improvement across these climate characteristics. So you can see there from these illustrations, at the end of June, we were seeing a 71% reduction in the level of fossil fuel reserve exposure in this index. We were seeing a 61% decrease or reduction in the level of weighted carbon emissions, and then a 66% increase on the level of green revenues. And those results are really not just due to the index provider. They're a result of a joint exercise that we did between yourselves, the index providers, FTSE, and the other local authorities within LGPS Central. So really, that's a very brief overview of the Climate Factor Fund. And just in summary, I think what we're offering is this very low cost, transparent, rules-based fund that can deliver a real significant improvement on climate and where you're positioned as a pension fund. It's one of our flagship funds, and we were really proud of it as a company. It's one that generates a lot of interest from our investors. Now, just briefly, another area that we're looking at is review of the traditional market cap benchmarks that we manage money against and that many of our investors or our pension funds are invested in. And really, we're conscious that partner funds and investors generally have a lot of money invested in these type of index fund strategies. However, there are a number of benchmarks now that have been developed which are really they're designed around market cap benchmarks, but rather than just focusing on the size of a company, they're adjusted to capture how well a company's positioning itself with Paris alignment and net zero and that transition to a low carbon economy. So So it's a really interesting development, one that we just wanted to mention to you. We're doing a lot of work on this area at the moment, and we'd be glad to come back and to talk to you as to how we progress there. So that's a very brief presentation of the developments we have made in passive equity investment and our climate factor fund, and I hope that's been of some interest to you. So on that, I'll hand back to Patrick.
Yes, thank you, David. I won't talk for very long, but just briefly in conclusion, we've talked about the fact that we think responsible corporate ownership is critical at this time. Decarbonisation is an important strategy, but divestment isn't necessarily the best approach to achieving that. LGPS Central already incorporates targeted voting and engagement strategies with dedicated in-house resource, and will continue to do that. And the demands and the asks that we make of companies will accelerate as the transition to a lower carbon economy accelerates, and in line with other investors. We're developing specialist asset classes specifically designed to take advantage of the opportunities associated with the transition to a lower carbon economy, but also designed to manage those risks. And just as one closing note, we'd like to leave you with a thought that it's not just engagement, it's engagement and ESG integration together that are vital to implementing appropriate climate strategies that will lead to the best outcomes for us as investors, but also other stakeholders. Thank you very much for your time today. I apologise that that's run on, and I got ahead of myself there by inviting questions from the panel. I apologise to the chair.
No, well, firstly, thank you very much for really a very comprehensive report on so many different aspects, and a big thank you to Patrick, Lorna, Mark and David for presenting today. I mean, there's an awful lot of information there which will be comprehensive, so thank you very much indeed for that. Let's move on, please, to item 10, introduction to setting a climate-related target. This is a presentation from Emily Mcguire, please. Simon,
I was going to ask, we've been 2.5 hours. Are you planning a comfort break, Chair?
I am, but I think maybe it might be opportune to have a comfort break sooner rather than later.
It helps the focus, I would suggest.
Yes. So, do members feel they'd like a comfort break now? All right. Anybody else?
Yes, please. Yeah, I feel it might be good to have one now and then between the main and the extensions as well.
Okay. Well, let's adjourn then for 5 minutes. But please do remember, we are still on video. We are still being down to the outer world. So there's a case just going and coming back. So we'll resume again in 5 minutes, please.
she's jointly with me. Okay, so we just wanted to give an update of where we are today. So we've heard a lot this morning about what LGPS Central are doing, and as we know the direction of travel with the assets that we have, we've got 12% invested with them at the moment, but likely to move up to 70%. So it's really important that we understand the way in which they're approaching these things in climate-related issues, as they're going to be the main stewardship of the assets going forward. So where we've got to is the Pensions Committee recognise the risks associated with climate change are really significant and complex. And actually taking that holistic approach to managing climate change will enable that transition and best enable that transition to a low carbon economy. And as the pension fund level, there's three ways we can really look at that. We've got the portfolio construction, so it's what assets we're invested with, which areas, whether it's equities, bonds, property, and how those are invested. So that's that portfolio construction level. We've got engagement with companies. We've heard a lot about that today and the impact that that can make, but also around policy advocacy as well, and influencing change, because this is actually a collaborative issue right across the industry that we need to achieve. So progress has been made. So we've heard over the last 12 months there's been a lot on the education front for the committee members, so we've had a lot of training and we'll continue to do so as we go through it, go forward as well. So on the identification of risks, we've already had the climate change report last year. We've got another one coming that really helps us identify where we are and analysis that's been done. We've had the TCFD reporting, and from those initial reports that we had, there have been proposals gone through to establish proper climate change strategy and a climate stewardship plan, which have both been drafted, and you've heard a little bit more about those today. So again, we've got that bit in train. Then we're also looking at the mitigation of risk, or the integration of ESG, and we heard about that this morning as well in a little bit more detail in the importance of that. So these are the things that are already being done. Okay, and we've got a session a little bit later of looking at, can we go one step further and to set some targets around climate related issues. And so we think this is an important next step, and so we've got a training session a little bit later to go through some of the implications of setting a climate change strategy, not for decision, but looking at the next steps and where we could go from here. So I will just pause there.
Okay, any questions? Yes, Robbie.
I note the comment about the training session later on. Is that the agenda item?
Yes,
it should not be an agenda item as such, because an agenda item and exclusion is governed by the government. To be in a part 2, it needs, as an agenda item, it needs to satisfy. Is that playing up?
My understanding, for it to be in a part 2 as an agenda item, it needs to satisfy certain government criteria. As a briefing session, okay, but it should not be an agenda item as such.
Well, all our other briefing and training sessions, if you remember, Roger, have been itemized on previous agendas.
I've only just joined this committee. I did wonder at the last meeting about one of the items that was there. Should it have been in the exclusion part? And I have written to officers and asked them to get legal confirmation that it does satisfy the appropriate government rules for a part 2 agenda item.
All I can say is that it's been customary practice of this committee, the training and briefing sessions.
Sorry, Chairman, if it's labelled as a briefing session, but if it's an agenda item, which is number 17, I would assume on this agenda, I'm not sure, and I would vote it is not to be excluded. It does not satisfy the government criteria to go on an agenda as it is.
Well, it is on the agenda. I'm going to take the chair's decision that it stays where it is. at times of 70 on this occasion. Yes, Carolyn.
I just wonder if I can make an adjustment, because I actually think Councillor Evans is probably right on the technical point, but maybe in future meetings we have the agenda, we have exempted items, then there's effectively a close of meeting, and then there's a space there for training. Maybe that's the way to deal with it.
Well, we haven't done it like that. I think officers need to sort of have a discussion about that, but useful suggestion. Okay, are there any questions for Emily at this stage? No. Okay, well in that case we'll move on to where are we now? Item 11, Climate Change Strategy Stewardship Plan. And I believe Justin, you're going to present on this, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. So obviously this is part of the extensive training programme that the committee has been going through over the last 12 months. And again today we've had an extensive training session on climate related issues. As mentioned earlier, we've done our own climate risk assessment carried out on the pension fund. That was back in August 2020. And we had a detailed presentation in September 2020 on that report from LGPS Central. There's a number of key findings listed within the report. I don't intend to go through them, but things like the equity portfolios are 13% more carbon efficient than the benchmark. We've got less exposure to fossil fuel reserves and those exploiting coal reserves. You've got more investments in companies that use clean technology, for example. We've also produced a detailed public TCFD report, and that was published in December last year, and that's been communicated to all the employers within the fund, and we also released a media statement and that was released. There's a number of important policy statements within that report in section 8. Again, I won't go through them, but there's a number of important statements that we've made. We have been out to consultation on this document throughout August and early September. We've had responses received back, which is very supportive of the climate strategy. So I'm happy to take any questions on it. There is the detailed climate strategy and stewardship plan is attached to Appendix A for approval, but happy to take any questions on the report.
Yes, Caroline.
Yeah, I've got a question on the report and then a question on the actual strategy. In terms of the report, you mentioned consultation just then, and in the report it does say that only 2 responses were received, which I think by anybody's benchmark is not a good response rate for a consultation. The consultation was sent out within the newsletter, so not particularly something that was obvious, I think, to respond to, and also had a link to the strategy, but again, we didn't have structured questions around it. It wasn't quite clear, I don't think, that what we were actually asking people to do in terms of make comment on that strategy. A huge number of our partners in the pension fund are schools who aren't there in August. No one's picking up the emails. The governors aren't meeting to discuss, so I would argue they're unable to respond to a consultation in August. And we've got 2 responses and said that they didn't require the strategy to be amended. I do know that one of those responses from Severn Gorge Countryside Trust, because I am a trustee on that trust, was that they requested that we should have, the pension fund continuing to invest in fossil fuels was undermining, the actual aim of getting to net zero, and so they had concerns about that, and I think that really needs merit to be mentioned in the report. I don't think we could just say that those responses didn't make a difference.
We seem to have framed a strategy which I was on page 207. We seem to have framed a strategy on page 207, which as an initial strategy, considering we haven't had one previously, is a big step forward. I accept that perhaps there could have been a better response to consultation, but whether that would have influenced the strategy or not is a different matter. So I'm happy that we at least have got a strategy which is pretty comprehensive
I noted in para 5 we will report progress on the stewardship plan, climate stewardship plan, on an annual basis. Possibly we may receive reports more frequently than that, but at least I hope that's at least on an annual basis. But it's a comprehensive strategy. I don't know how further consultation might have brought any amendments, but I'm happy to adopt this strategy, and in the light of future events in terms of climate movement in climate policy internationally, we may find that we can adjust the strategy in due course. But for the present, I'm happy with it, and I move adoption.
Sorry, not a second as much as a comment.
All right, comment, Laura, please. Yes.
Something I'm quite disappointed about is the lack of, I think, direction towards the people we are going to ask to then, like fund managers, to go and take on. What I got from LGPS today felt far more comprehensive than the document that I've got in front of me here, and I feel that we should be pushing them, not allowing them to drag us in this. Something I'm particularly disappointed about is that we'll consider investments that are greener, rather than we will prioritise investments that are greener. I'm not saying we should always do it in every single situation, but just little changes in words there I think will make a really big impact in how it looks, because at the moment it feels a little bit lacking.
We're open to do that in the future. In fact, we're one of the very first pension funds in the country to be looking at adopting a climate change strategy. So don't underestimate that we are actually groundbreaking today by doing this. There's an annual review, and I think there's twice a year monitoring of how we're actually performing, how the fund is performing against criteria. So it is very much a working document, and it's a document that's going to evolve. But I think the important thing is to get it in place, and that's what we're hopefully going to do today. Carolyn.
Yeah, again, just coming back to the consultation, I think, yes, of course we want to get a strategy in place, and I'm supportive of that. I've got some points on the strategy which I'll come to, but I think we do need to recognise that we probably need to consult again, maybe as part of the refresh, the next annual review, and that we do it at a time that isn't in the summer holidays, and then when people actually have are very clear that what the consultation is. It's not embedded in the newsletter, and that that they've got opportunity to respond properly to that consultation. I also think, and I note that in the communication that went out to ask for employer views on the strategy, it sort of said that there wasn't going to be a direct from the fund to employees consultation, but that if employers wanted to consult with their employees, then that was up to them. I think that's a fair position. And I suppose I would just ask a question. As the largest contributor to the pension fund, has Shropshire Council consulted its own employees on this climate change strategy?
So the consultation went out to Shropshire Council as well, like all other employers, and Shropshire Council did not respond.
Right. Okay, so we've got a bit of a gap then with employers, so maybe that's again something to think about in the future.
We've got the recommendation. Members are asked to approve the climate change strategy.
Chair, if I may, I've got a point on the strategy, so I would like to propose a slight amendment, if that's okay, before we go to that. We've had a lot of discussion today, haven't we, about the merits of engagement over divestment, and I think James at the start you sort of talked about that we shouldn't have just go down a divestment route, because actually we're losing, by not having engagement, we're losing one of the tools at our disposal. I would argue the same holds true, that by just saying we are just going to focus on engagement and reject divestment, we're also losing a tool in our armour. So I would just like to have in the strategy where we talk about that we will continue to influence investing companies through routine engagement, by voting and so on, that we also then have the option to divest, so that we retain the option to divest should that engagement fail. And I think that would be a minor change that ensures we have all the tools at our disposal to deal with make sure that our fund is, gets us to, is Paris compliant, which is something that we've said we want to do in our beliefs.
Okay, well, you're proposing that as an amendment, and Roger, you're seconding.
I will second that, Chairman. I noted the comment about, to use a phrase that I use at times, it's better to be inside the tent to argue than outside the tent. And I think there comes a time when you need to leave that tent just to show what you want, and maybe to put pressure on those that are still in there.
Okay, well, we've got to vote. We'll take the amendment first. Those in favour of the amendment, please show. Those against the amendment, please show. Okay, so we go back to the original proposition, which is the recommendation on the report. The members are asked to approve the climate change strategy and stewardship plan at Appendix A. All those in favour, please. Those against, and any abstentions? Two abstentions. Thank you very much. Just want to emphasise it is a working document. We're going to review it often, so but at least we have actually now got it, which we didn't have before. Okay, and we're one of the very few pension funds in the country that has got it. So it is groundbreaking. Thank you very much. So we'll move on then now to item 12, corporate governance monitoring, and who will take that, please? Justin.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the quarterly update report on corporate governance and monitoring. So members should be very familiar with this report. For any new members on the committee, it details all our engagement and voting activities. So there's very detailed appendices attached to the report on all our fund managers, how they voted, how LGPS Central deal with ESG, how Legal and General deal with the ESG, for example. So there's detailed information in the appendices there. We also use a company called BMO, who engage with all the companies that we invest in globally on our behalf. There's details in there again about the climate risk strategy and stewardship plan, which builds on all the training we've had before. And section 9 in that report is particularly important because it states significant progress we've made since the council motion, and how seriously we are taking this as a pension fund. All the achievements to date, all the training, all the reports, all the chair's statements, they're all live public meetings that people can listen into. So I urge members of the committee, especially new members of the committee, to look back. This is going to be on since July 20, on all the meetings, all the presentations, all the detailed reports and training that's been undertaken on these very important issues, as I said. So happy to take any questions, but it's just a paper to note.
Okay, well,
sorry, is this the one with the engagements with all the graphs with the blobs on? Just checking them in the right place.
It is, yes.
Yeah, just purely that it comes back to something I've talked about before about engagement. There are lots of companies who are poor at engagement, and the question is, at what point do we take note, and what point do we put pressure on to say we need to either have some results from this, or we need to step away from them? Because it's something I keep on seeing every time I see these. I see companies come up and again as poor, and we're not seeing any change on that. And one particular example that on page 227 I've written, the company used it as an example, and we put out requests for this, which they have not met. Outcomes not applicable. Escalated issues, none. So what's the point if we're not going to actually have any fallback for these companies when they're failing to engage with us? I don't think there's anything we can do right now, but I wanted to make the point. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine, Laura, and thanks for the comments. And as you're aware, we've also had all of those managers listed who produce those appendices. So BMO, Mcguire, Legal and General, LGPS Central, they've been to committee, and asked specifically, those type of questions, and proving how engagements worked over the last 12 months, and they'll continue to come to committee over the next 12 months to give updates on all that.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I move the recommendations. Can I have a seconder, please? Simon, everybody in favour? Yeah, thank you very much. So that's over now to agenda item 13, investment strategy statement, and that's again is Justin, please.
Yeah, so this has been approved by Pensions Committee several times before in 2017, 2019. The members will be aware that obviously we had 4 investment strategy workshops, and we agreed a revised investment strategy in March 2021 this year. So the investment strategy statement has just been updated really to reflect our new strategic asset allocation for the pension fund, the changes we've made on the equity protection over the last 12 months as well. So that's been updated, and further reference to the climate strategy and the public TCFD report and the pension fund carbon footprint, all the analysis we've done on that. So it is this for approval today. The large majority has been approved several times before by committees, just to refresh it due to the recent changes that we've made to our investment strategy. Happy to take any comments on that.
Right.
Since the pension fund has increased quite considerably, and we're now at or very close to 100% funded, I guess our strategy must be working, and I'm happy to move it.
Thank you. A second, please. I'll second. All those in favour? Very good. Thank you very much. Item 14, pensions administration monitoring, and that is Debbie, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just also want to thank the Chair for acknowledging the team's work. That is appreciated, and I will pass that on, so thank you. The report gives a whistle-stop tour of what's been engaging the team over the last quarter. You will see at point 4 there, we just recently engaging with the actuary preemptively of the full fund valuation next year to do an interim valuation. We've been doing year-end cleansing, and that was all completed by the 30th of June, which feeds into the valuations, the interim valuations, but also into the annual benefit statements that statutorily we have to send out to all of our members. And I just wanted to thank the employers as well in the fund for complying and ensuring that all our data is sent on time. We've got a good history with engagement with our employers and the data. We get feedback from the actuary that we have good data, and that is down to the employers engaging with us. So just want to put on record to thank them for doing that on time this year as well. Item 5, 6 there around the help desk and our stats and our work plan. Work is going on, working at the moment to improve the member experience on our self-service online. Digital is the way forward. We ensure that we're covering all of our membership, so paper communication is still done when it's necessary, but also members need to self-serve nowadays, so we are working to ensure that they get the best possible out of our online portal. Annual benefit statements all went out on time. There was only 7 out of 33,500 that we couldn't get, and that was down to a systems error, but those individual people have been written to, and as soon as the provider has provided us with a fix, they will get their statement. So overall, we were fully compliant with the statutory obligation. 6.5, there's a member education session being run with our benefit advisor Mercer's around the tax implications of annual pensions growth. That's in October. A big area now since HMRC reduced the amount that individuals can grow their pension by, so then more of our members are getting a tax bill. So the communication has all gone out on that exercise. And we've also updated the communication policy. You'll see there at point 6. Mostly to do with the practices that have been put in place now as a result of COVID and working from home, and the tweaks around how we're engaging with our employers and our members. And at point 10, and also as one of the appendices, there's a useful documentation from Aon that's come out there all about the dashboard that At the moment, we're sort of getting information about what we're actually going to need to do for that, all about onboarding the information that we're going to have to ensure that we've got accurate for our members to go through the dashboard that has to be in place for our size scheme at the moment in sort of 2023 to 2025. So that's going to be a big exercise that comes out from the Pension Schemes Act 2021, that all pensions fund will need to be engaging with the government to ensure that we can be compliant. And I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Any questions, members? Yes, Laura.
So sorry, I have two. One about the pensions dashboard. Actually, it's not a question. It's just to say that looks like it's going to be a huge piece of work. And so as a committee, I think we should make sure that we understand when the stats change and more hours are going to have to go into it. This is understandable, and it's not anything that your team have done wrong. It's because it's being imposed top down. Although I think it is actually a really cool idea for someone like me who already has 3 pensions and may well pick up more over the next 30 years when working. The other one is actually funding strategy statement, which doesn't quite fit, but on my agenda it fits in the right order. And it's talking about salary increases and budgeting for 1.5% per annum above inflation. The reality on the ground is we haven't had pay rises above inflation for a very, very long time. And I'm wondering that there might be a gap in our budget that is widening if we continue to assume that we're going to get above inflation pay rises. Much as Unison are obviously fighting for above inflation pay rises, it's not what we've seen thus far. And it's just something to point out that I'm slightly concerned about. There might be a gap in expectation and reality. Thank you for the questions. Dashboard is a big budget implication as well as a work implication, so that will be on our work plan going forward. So thank you for the recognition of that. The pay inflation also has to take into account pay rises as well. So as well as the annual increase, it will also take into account promotions. And the actuary takes a very close look at salary movement across all of employers at each valuation. And they do tweak that and they do look at it, but at the moment they are happy with what's been set, but it isn't just the annual increase. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? No? Well, in that case, the recommendations are to accept the position as set out in the report, and secondly, to approve with or without comment revised communications policy at Appendix B. I move and second it, please, Brian. Yeah. All those in favour? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we move out of public session into the exclusion of the press and public, and I would like to move the proposition to do exactly that, to consider a resolution under paragraph 10.2 of the Council's access to information procedure rules for the proceedings of the committee in relation to agenda items 16 to 21 shall not be conducted in public on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined by the categories specified against them. I move that. May I have a seconder, please? Roger? Yep, all those.
Sorry, Chairman, I'm not seconding. I'm just saying that I will be voting against it on the principle that item 17 should not be included in it. The rest of it, I'm okay with, but item 17 should not be included in that, and therefore I will not be voting in favour.
Okay.
Explanation.
Seconder, please, Brian. All
professional seconder.
Okay. So all in favour except for Roger. And Carolyn, you're both voting against. Okay.
I agree as well.
Yep. Okay. Very good. So we now move on.